Hello, fellow Sapiens, and a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're winding down beneath a blanket of stars, listening on a long train ride, or filling the silence of a sleepless night, this space is for you. Because tonight, we journey into a story about how humans learn to sleep in a world filled with predators. This is slow science and deep storytelling for curious minds. It's an untold chapter of survival that begins on the Mammoth Steppe, over 30,000 years ago, when firelight flickered and breath met frost. But this is not a tale of panic and hiding. It's not the story of prey, but of strategy, memory, and trust. And, if you find beauty in long-form, poetic science, if you enjoy learning slowly and thinking deeply, consider tapping like and subscribe. That small gesture helps thoughtful storytelling like this reach others who need it. I often wonder, where are you listening from right now? What time is it for you? If you feel like sharing in the comments, it's a quiet reminder that we are all listening together. Also, feel free to fall asleep whenever you like. The full chapter list is down in the description. Now, let's begin with a fear older than language and the night that taught us how to rest. How did they sleep? That is the quiet question behind everything we are about to explore. Because by all modern logic, they should not have survived the night. Picture it. No walls, no windows, no locks, just open sky, bare ground, and the sound of breath beside a fire slowly dying. Around them moved cave lions the size of ponies, hyenas with bone-crushing jaws, and wolves that hunted in disciplined silence. And yet, they slept. Not just for a night, but for generations. This is the mystery we begin with. How Ice Age humans survived sleeping outdoors, surrounded by wolves and lions, on the open plains of the Mammoth Steppe. We begin not with weapons or battles, but with a place. The Mammoth Steppe was a biome unlike anything we know today. An enormous, cold grassland that stretched across the northern hemisphere, from modern-day France to far eastern Siberia, across what is now Alaska, and down into the central plains of North America. This was one of the most expansive ecosystems ever to exist. And it flourished during the coldest chapters of the Ice Age. Not a world of glaciers, but of wide open spaces, dry winds, and endless herds. Steppe bison, woolly rhinos, giant elk, and of course, the mammoths. But where there are prey animals, there are also predators. And where there are predators, the question of sleep becomes more than a biological need. It becomes a problem to be solved. The humans who lived here, late Paleolithic populations of Homo sapiens, were not helpless wanderers. They were seasoned tacticians of the wild. Small groups, usually no more than 20 to 40 individuals, moved across the land following the seasonal rhythms of animals and plants. They built no permanent homes, no towering cities. But they carried a map in their minds. Of terrain, scent, sound, memory, they knew where the ground turned soft under snow, where the wind blew predator scent uphill, where a fallen tree might shelter a den of cubs. Every night's rest was a negotiation between fatigue and risk. And still, they slept. The very act of lying down was a calculated choice. And in that choice lies the clue to a forgotten kind of intelligence. Today, the idea of sleeping outside unprotected is often framed with fear. We picture lurking danger, creeping figures in the dark. But this fear is not ancient. It is modern. It is born of disconnection, a life behind barriers. Our ancestors understood something different. They did not conquer the wilderness by overpowering it. They learned how to move within it, to speak its language, to disappear when necessary. Their safety did not come from fighting predators, but from avoiding their attention altogether. A strategy not of domination, but of presence. And so we return to the question, how did they sleep? But to understand how they slept, we must first understand the stage on which they lived. The Mammoth Steppe was not an Arctic wasteland, nor a frozen forest. It was a corridor of open grasslands, scattered with dry shrubs and windswept hillocks. A cold, semi-arid expanse that wrapped around the upper third of the globe like a pale green ribbon. It may seem inhospitable to us now, but it was one of the richest ecosystems of its time. In fact, some scientists describe it as a kind of Pleistocene Serengeti, only colder and much, much larger. What made it so vibrant was not the warmth, but the predictability. The ground froze in winter and bloomed in spring. Herds moved in great loops. Rivers followed ancient courses, often shallow and braided, cutting through permafrost and silt. This predictability gave human groups the ability to anticipate where animals would be, and more importantly, where predators would follow. The land itself became a kind of memory system, a quiet logic embedded in hills, tracks, and scent. It's easy to imagine this world as bleak, but that would be a mistake. Beneath the low sun, the air would shimmer with ice crystals and golden dust. Herds of mammoths could darken the horizon, moving slowly like living mountains, and above them, clouds trailed shadows across miles of open space. It was a world of breath and movement, not silence. And yet, for the human beings living in it, silence was one of their most powerful tools. Our modern imagination often projects panic onto prehistory, but evidence suggests something very different. In the archaeological record, we see no signs of frantic, defensive architecture from this period. No walls, no ditches, no mass graves with signs of last stands. What we see instead are camps, temporary, fluid, intelligently placed. Hearths built in circles. Sleeping areas nestled near ridges, riverbanks, or natural windbreaks. Remains of butchered animals placed with methodical precision, often downwind from where people slept. Even discarded bones were not thrown carelessly. Some were arranged to signal territory, or perhaps to dissuade scavengers. This was not the behavior of terrified people. This was the behavior of people who understood something deeply fundamental, that survival at night did not come from fighting back, but from never being noticed at all, from blending into the rhythm of the steppe, not disrupting it. And perhaps this is where we begin to feel the dissonance between modern danger and ancient danger. Today, fear is often sharp and unpredictable. It comes in headlines, alarms, flashing lights. But, in the Ice Age, danger was patient. It circled. It sniffed. It calculated, and our ancestors responded not with panic, but with foresight. Still, the question remains. When the sun went down and shadows stretched across the frozen grass, how did they truly rest? To understand how they rested, we have to look not at the predators, but at the people, because survival, in those long Ice Age nights, was not an individual task. It was communal. When we imagine prehistoric sleep, we often picture someone curled under a hide alone, one ear turned to the darkness. But the archaeological pattern tells a different story, one of collective strategy, of people lying close together in loosely organized circles, backs and shoulders touching, breath rising in slow clouds. It may seem like a small thing, but sleeping in a circle is not just about warmth, it is about awareness. In this position, the human ear is oriented outward. A body twitching in sleep can trigger a cascade of reactions. A change in breathing, the sound of movement, even a shift in the scent of wind, all of it becomes part of a shared sensor system. Before there were alarm bells, there were bodies. Before there were walls, there were patterns of stillness and disturbance. And this is not guesswork. In some Ice Age sites, we find ash rings and compressed earth patches arranged in rounded forms, places where fires once burned at the center, and people likely slept around the glow. At sites like Dolny Viestanice and Predmosti in Moravia, or Yana RHS in Siberia, the positioning of hearths, stone tools, and animal bones suggest intentional spatial planning. These were not random stops. They were well-considered resting grounds. Still, no strategy, no matter how careful, could guarantee safety. So humans didn't only rely on proximity and pattern, they used another tool: knowledge of the predators themselves. The animals of the steppe were formidable, lions larger than any alive today, hyenas that could crush femurs, packs of wolves trained by evolution to exploit weakness in herds. But here is the quiet twist. Most predators avoid risk. They are opportunists, not warriors. A lion will not attack a target that might injure it. A wolf pack avoids chaos. Even a hyena knows the cost of an unnecessary fight. And our ancestors knew this. They learned how to look just threatening enough, just unpredictable enough, to make predators reconsider. Some researchers believe the very act of a fire burning at night wasn't simply for heat or light. It was a performance, a signal to predators that something here was alert, awake, human, not prey. The placement of the fire, the scattering of bones, the flicker of movement, all may have been calibrated to create an illusion of wakefulness. Even while most of the group slept, this was not brute survival. This was a form of soft warfare, a negotiation of presence, and the humans of the Mammoth Steppe became masters of it. But even with all this, the fire could go out, the wind could shift, a lion could still approach. And that brings us back to the mystery that lingers in every Ice Age campsite. When the stars turned overhead and everything else faded into darkness, how did they keep the night at bay? Perhaps the answer lies in something more subtle than fire or formation, something older than tools and quieter than speech. It lies in awareness not of danger, but of rhythm, the rhythm of wind, the rhythm of footsteps across frozen moss, the rhythm of how fear flows through an animal's body, and how humans learn to sense that rhythm without needing to see it. Because every predator leaves a pattern, not just in tracks or scat, but in how it moves through the land. A pack of wolves will circle into the wind. A hyena follows a habitual path between den and feeding ground. Even lions, stealthy as they are, prefer open terrain for ambushes and avoid thick brush that slows their charge. These behaviors repeat, again and again, over days, seasons, years, and if you pay attention long enough, they begin to feel almost mathematical. It is likely that Ice Age humans knew these patterns the way a sailor knows currents, not by charts, but by memory, repetition, and instinct. They would have watched how birds rose from grasses in certain places, where animal calls went suddenly silent, where the smell of blood lingered longer than it should. In these signs, they found not just knowledge but foresight, and foresight is what allowed them to sleep. Some campsites show evidence of seasonal reuse. Year after year, small groups returned to the same ridgelines, the same groves near water, the same clearings that gave them visibility and airflow. These were not desperate scavengers dropping wherever they could. They were planners, geographers of danger, students of ecology. At the site of Yana RHS in northeastern Siberia, dating to nearly 30,000 years ago, humans lived in a place colder than modern Arctic towns. Yet the remains suggest not suffering, but stability. Mammoth bones used as windbreaks, fire pits carefully dug, tools distributed with purposeful spacing. It suggests they didn't just survive, they knew exactly how. And that knowledge passed by gesture, by example, perhaps by story, is what allowed sleep to become possible. Not total, unconscious vulnerability, but a soft sleep, a layered rest, where someone was always half awake, where the line between dream and vigilance blurred, where survival was not a victory over nature, but a constant dance with it. There is something deeply human in this, the ability to feel danger without panic, to prepare without paranoia, to look into the night and know that you are not invisible, but not defenseless either. Still, we have to ask, even with all this knowledge, with firelight and wind patterns and careful placement, how did they deal with the moment when something truly approached? What happened when silence broke? We do not have many clear answers to that question. But in the places where the silence broke, where something came too close, or someone didn't wake in time, we find quiet forensic echoes. A broken bone that healed crooked, a pile of fire-hardened spears, scorch marks on mammoth rib fragments, placed intentionally at the edge of a hearth. These are not signs of constant disaster. They are signs of preparation, contingency, a kind of emotional engineering built not from fear but from realism. It is likely that every group had its own way of handling those moments. Perhaps someone always stayed awake, crouched near the fire with a rattle or a sharpened stake. Perhaps the dogs, or proto-dogs, those early, watchful scavengers who had started trailing human camps, gave a low growl before anything could get too close. Perhaps the group shifted sleep in waves, light dozing, a sudden jolt, listening for breath that didn't sound quite right. We don't know exactly what they did when a lion stepped too near the circle, but we know they survived. That their children woke up the next morning, groggy but alive. That they moved camp the next day, a little wiser, a little more cautious, but not undone. And that tells us something profound, because in our modern world, we often assume that peace and safety come from barriers, from walls, systems, and defenses that shut danger out completely. But the people of the Mammoth Steppe lived in a world where danger was never absent. It circled nightly. It sniffed the air while they dreamed. And still, they found a way to lie down, to close their eyes, to let go. That kind of trust in each other, in the rhythms of nature, in the sharpness of their preparation, may be one of the most overlooked forms of intelligence we have ever inherited. So what does that leave us with? A fire in the dark, a circle of breath, a child curled beside an elder, bones placed just so, and the vast silence of the steppe, broken only by wind and dreams. The truth is, they did not survive by fighting the wilderness head-on. They survived by learning how to disappear inside it. And that leads us to a deeper question, one that drifts like smoke across time. How do you vanish in a world where every predator is watching, listening, and smelling you in the dark? Truth is, they did not survive by fighting the wilderness head-on. They survived by learning how to disappear inside it. But how do you vanish in a world where every predator is watching, listening, and smelling you in the dark? There is no single answer to that question, only a quiet, evolving craft passed between generations. And that craft began not with tools, but with decisions. Before the first fire was lit, before a single bone was split for marrow, the first line of defense was placement. Not what you carried, but where you chose to stop. Because the predators of the Mammoth Steppe, lions, wolves, hyenas, they were not random in their movements. They followed paths carved by hunger and wind. They circled low points where scent pooled, skirted ridgelines where the wind betrayed their approach, and drifted toward the same clearings again and again, pulled by memory and instinct. To survive, humans had to read this invisible map, and then find the blank spaces in between. We find clues in the patterns of ancient campsites. In site after site, hearths and shelters are not placed in valleys, but on gentle rises, not in the open, but beside glacial boulders or thickets of brush that bent the wind just enough to carry scent safely away. At places like Kostenki in Russia or Mezerich in Ukraine, camps cluster along river terraces high enough to see, low enough to remain unnoticed. These are not random choices. They are a form of calculus, a geometry of absence, and perhaps even more telling is where we don't find remains. The vast steppe was enormous, yet the camps that survive are not evenly spread. They cluster in places of tactical advantage near water, yes, but not directly on the banks. Close to game trails, but not along them. On slopes where firelight won't cast long shadows that flicker across the plains. These are the decisions of people who understood that the line between safety and disaster could be no wider than a breath. Modern military science sometimes refers to this as the terrain of invisibility, the art of not being where the threat expects you to be. But Ice Age humans didn't study it. They lived it. They likely spoke in gestures when entering new ground, noting the direction of the wind by how smoke twisted or how birds circled. They touched the soil to feel if it was still warm from hoof or paw. They watched for the absence of motion, because even silence has texture. A still clearing is not always a safe one. And then, only after all of this, would they settle. A fire might be lit, tools laid out, hides unpacked. But even in rest, the first rule held true survival began with disappearing into the land. To disappear is not the same as to hide. Hiding is temporary. Disappearing is systemic. It is a relationship between the body and the land, between movement and memory. It means anticipating not just what might happen, but what the predator expects you to do, and then, quietly, doing the opposite. This is where tracking becomes more than a skill. It becomes a philosophy. Because to choose the right camp, our ancestors had to understand not only where animals had been, but where they were likely to go next. And this meant reading the ground like a scroll, a broken blade of grass, a tuft of fur caught in the bark of a low tree, scattered dung that had dried just enough to betray time. Even the moisture in footprints, how quickly it evaporated, how it soaked into sand or frost, could whisper how many hours had passed since a wolf passed through. But they were not just reading predators, they were also reading prey. The trail of a mammoth herd, for example, was more than a source of meat. It also meant that large predators had likely been following. And so, humans would scan the edges of the trail where hyenas might lag, or where a lion might have paused beneath a low tree to rest. These were invisible intersections, and knowing how to avoid them was everything. In some places, the seasonal timing mattered just as much as location. There were times of year when danger intensified, the lean weeks before spring, the migration windows when herds crossed frozen rivers, the darkening days when food scarcity made predators bold. Our ancestors didn't just avoid risk randomly, they avoided it rhythmically, by tracking how scent and hunger moved across the calendar. We can still see this in the archaeological record, though only in traces. Some campsites show long periods of use, then sudden abandonment, then a return months later. Not because the site had failed, but because something was passing through, something that made it wise to vanish altogether. And when they returned, they would find their hearths buried under leaves or drifted with snow, but still intact, still known. This kind of knowledge is hard to measure in stones and bones, but the pattern tells us something. These were not people reacting in panic. They were responding with foresight. Their behavior suggests not desperation, but decision. To walk away from a place you know well and wait takes patience. To sleep without leaving scent, to cook where the wind won't carry the smell of grease, to leave a trail that does not reveal your weight or group size. These are not accidents. They are techniques. And every technique has a lesson hidden in it. So the question begins to emerge. How many of these decisions were made in words, and how many in silence? What was passed between generations not by language, but by imitation? There is a kind of silence that is learned, not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. And that silence may have been one of the most valuable things passed from elder to child, not in explanation, but in example. A touch to the shoulder when the wind shifted, a pause before crossing a shallow stream, a gesture toward an animal track whose meaning didn't need to be spoken aloud. In a world where speech could betray your position, awareness became a language of its own, and the earth remembers some of this. When we excavate Ice Age sites, what we often find are not dramatic scenes, but small, quiet signatures of careful lives. At Pavlov and Dolny Vestonis in southern Moravia, for example, camps were nestled near limestone outcrops that offered both shelter and visual cover. The locations give broad views over valleys, yet are themselves partially shielded. It's as if the people who camped there wanted to see without being seen, not hidden, but hard to notice. And that distinction matters. In other sites, like Kostenki or Sungir, humans seem to have preferred raised ground overlooking water, but not too close to it. Close enough to fetch it, but not close enough to be surprised by what might follow the shoreline at dusk. Even the angle of slope appears to have mattered. A gentle incline to carry scent away, a break in the trees that funneled wind just so. And these weren't one-off decisions. When we map clusters of Ice Age camps over time, the same principles repeat over hundreds, even thousands of years. This is not random. It is tradition made spatial. What the bones can't tell us, we can only infer. But the soil speaks in layers, where fires burned, where sleeping areas were cleaned and recleaned, where waste was deposited downwind and far from where children might sleep. All of these choices reinforce the same idea. Survival was not just about tools, it was about habits. Even the arrangement of stones around hearths seems deliberate, not just for heat, but perhaps to shape the glow of firelight to limit its range, or to disguise its origin from predators watching from the tree line. And if there is no tree line, then a boulder, a slope, a cut in the land. It is easy to imagine these people as rough and reactive. But what the archaeology shows is composure, long thinking, layered decision-making, an ability to read the landscape, not as a stage for danger, but as a puzzle to be solved with presence. And beneath all of this lies the real question. How many dangers never arrived? Simply because the camp had been placed in the one spot no predator had reason to pass. What threats were prevented not by confrontation, but by absence? There's something humbling about the idea that the greatest survival skill of our ancestors may not have been bravery or strength, but the ability to not be there when danger arrived. Avoidance is not a retreat, it is an art. And that art required attention not just to the land itself, but to the invisible forces that moved across it: scent, wind, rhythm, shadow. The human body, for all its vulnerability, became something like a measuring instrument, a way to feel the subtle shifts in atmosphere that an animal might miss, but another human would understand intuitively. We tend to think of invisibility as something magical, something cinematic. But, for the people of the steppe, invisibility was practical. It was the outcome of hundreds of small decisions, stacked like stones. A trail chosen not because it was short, but because it left no footprints in snow. A pause before setting camp to study how sound echoed between trees. A fire built in a hollow instead of on a rise. Each choice, on its own, might seem insignificant, but taken together, they created a perimeter of uncertainty around the group, a kind of cognitive camouflage, and sometimes that camouflage extended beyond the camp itself. There is evidence that in certain regions, humans may have established decoy zones, piles of bones or broken tools, left deliberately, downwind and in open view, not as garbage, but as misinformation, a way to make a predator think. Someone was here. Someone passed through. But not now. Not anymore. Whether these were intentional or simply a side effect of practical behavior, we cannot say for sure. But their positioning always away from hearths, always aligned with prevailing wind, suggests a strategy, a kind of behavioral perimeter, an invitation for danger to pass by, or linger just long enough in the wrong place before moving on. We also see spatial choreography within the camp itself. Hearths are rarely placed randomly. They often sit near the center, shielded on at least one side, while tools and food remains arc outward. There's often a clean zone, a radius beyond which waste accumulates, but not within. Children's artifacts tend to be clustered closer to fire, but the edges, the periphery, remain carefully managed. In this way, the camp becomes more than a resting spot. It becomes a shape in the land, a form of architecture without walls, a structure made of absence and orientation, invisible to the eye, but legible to any predator who has learned to read the signs. And perhaps that's the most poetic part of all. The predators came looking for prey. They smelled ash. They saw no movement, no shapes that suggested weakness, no sound that betrayed distraction. And so, they turned away. Not because of confrontation, but because the humans had made themselves into a space. The predator could not enter, not physically, but conceptually. So we ask again, how do you defeat a threat you never meet? Perhaps by never giving it the script it expects to follow. Even now, when we walk through open landscapes, there are places that feel quiet in a particular way. Not just silent, but undisturbed, as if something passed through long ago and left no mark. That is the legacy of this art. The humans of the Mammoth Steppe learned to shape the land by how they didn't change it. They moved with the grain of the terrain, not against it. They let the wind be their boundary, the scent be their shield, and the rhythm of animals be their calendar. Theirs was a world of prediction, not reaction, of invisibility by design, not by chance. And the remarkable thing is that we still see the fingerprints of these decisions tens of thousands of years later. Not in grand ruins or inscriptions, but in the negative space, the places where danger never touched, the slope that remained untouched, the cluster of hearths that stayed undisturbed, the bones that tell us where predators did not go. To disappear, for them, was not to become nothing. It was to become unreadable to the creatures that hunted by scent and silhouette. It was to be present without being detectable, to be felt without being tracked. It was, in a way, to become a rumor in the wind. Even the way they left a site tells us something. Some camps show near total cleanup. Hearths scraped, debris removed, bones stacked or scattered with intention. Others seem abandoned mid-use, yet still show no signs of violence or panic. Perhaps they left in a hurry because they sensed something before it arrived. Perhaps they had already prepared another site, downwind, ready to occupy when the rhythm changed. There may have been a cycle of camps, a constellation of safe zones rotated over the seasons, a nomadic architecture, defined not by permanence, but by foresight. Some scientists believe that humans may have returned to certain camps over decades, even centuries, rebuilding their fire pits where old ash still lingered. And perhaps the land itself became part of memory. A child taught to watch the bend of the river, a grandmother pointing to a ridge where a lion once passed. No written language was needed. The stories were in the placement, in the wind, in the dirt beneath their feet. What this reveals is a kind of thinking that is not often associated with prehistory. Not reactive, but architectural. Not accidental, but systemic. And all of it, the placement, the tracking, the silence, came together in the structure of the camp itself. But if the location of the camp was their first line of defense, then what happened inside that space? What clues do we find in how they shaped the sleeping circle, the fire, the refuse, the periphery? And how might those physical arrangements of bodies, bones, and boundaries tell us what they feared most? The haunting question, then, is what did the shape of the camp reveal about the shape of their thoughts? Because once the right location had been chosen, safe from the wind, concealed from predators, tactically invisible to the eye and nose, another layer of defense began. A smaller, human circle within the greater silence. A space built not with walls or tools but with proximity and warmth. The sleep circle was rarely just a matter of comfort. It was a structure flexible but deliberate that offered security through shared presence. In nearly every ethnographic record of nomadic peoples, and in the spatial patterns left by Paleolithic camps, we find the same basic form. A loosely defined ring, with the fire at or near its center, and people sleeping in a rough spiral around it. This formation created multiple advantages: shared body heat, a reduction of exposed edges, a communal field of listening and alertness, and more than that, it allowed vulnerability to be distributed. A single person sleeping alone is defenseless, but a group lying close together, elders at the center, children between adults, hunters facing outward, creates a structure in which no one is ever truly alone. Movement becomes communication. A sudden shift, a sharp inhale, the small sound of someone rising in the dark. All of it could ripple through the sleeping group before a predator ever reached the firelight. Some archaeologists have suggested that this pattern left marks in the soil, not always in the form of architectural remains, but in the placement of hearths, ash scatters, and sleeping mats made of plant material or animal hide. The repeated clearing of a central area, surrounded by debris radiating outward in a partial ring, may be a subtle forensic trace of this circle. Not fixed, but remembered. Not drawn, but walked. At open-air sites like Mezherik in Ukraine or Okladnikov Cave in Siberia, this radial organization appears again and again: food discarded at a distance, stone flakes in concentric distribution, hearths sunken into the earth, and circled by bone fragments. It is not proof in the strictest sense, but it is suggestion, a shape that emerges not from one site, but from many. And what's striking is how that shape resembles a social map. Not just a physical arrangement, but a philosophy of protection. The idea that safety could be increased not by separation, but by intimacy. And so the circle became more than just a place to lie down. It became a body in itself, one with a core, a skin, and a periphery, one that breathed together in the dark. If the sleeping circle was the body, then the perimeter was its skin, porous, quiet, but alive with intention. And while the Ice Age camp had no fences, it did have boundaries. These were made not with bricks or beams, but with the language of texture, scent, and obstacle. The outer edge of a human camp was defined by what was placed there and what was not. Bones, for example, were not always discarded carelessly. At several Upper Paleolithic sites, including Dolny Viestanis and Predmosty, we find rings of large bones, mammoth scapulae, long bones, and ribs arranged around central areas. Some believe these were windbreaks. Others suggest they helped delineate the edge of activity zones. But a third possibility lingers, that they were passive deterrents, not walls, but signals. Large predators are not reckless. A hyena is unlikely to cross a pile of unfamiliar bone unless desperate. The scent of old meat, the sharp edges of splintered ivory, the uncertain footing. These factors can make even a hungry animal pause. And that pause may have been all the humans needed. The same logic may apply to tools. Broken flint blades, when discarded along the outer edge of camp, created a jagged terrain beneath the paws of any intruder. Whether this was intentional or incidental is hard to determine, but over time, the result was the same. A textured ring of discomfort, radiating outward from the sleeping bodies. Thorns and brush may have played a similar role. In regions where such vegetation was available, especially in southern parts of the Mammoth Steppe, where shrubs and woody plants grew along river corridors, thorny branches could have been dragged and laid in piles. Not as full barriers, but as patches of resistance. To step on such a pile in the dark is to hesitate. To hesitate is to be noticed. We see a similar principle in the camps of modern hunter-gatherers. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, for example, thorn hedges are still used to encircle sleeping areas, not to stop predators outright, but to create just enough interference to trigger a sound, a movement, a reaction. Perhaps this is what Ice Age humans discovered too, that you don't need to prevent an approach entirely. You only need to make it unpredictable. Make the perimeter feel watched. Make the cost of entry slightly too high. And in doing so, shift the risk calculation back to the predator. This kind of perimeter, improvised, evolving, and partly invisible, would have required constant maintenance. As the fire burned down and the night deepened, someone may have quietly stood to rearrange a bone, to throw a tool shard into the outer dark, to add a branch where one had sagged. Small acts of maintenance, barely movements at all, but together they shaped a space that whispered, "Here, we are awake. Here, we are ready." But the perimeter was only part of the equation. Within the circle, there was a choreography of objects and actions, a quiet architecture shaped by instinct, memory, and repetition. It was not random where they placed the fire, nor where they prepared food, nor where they cast away the scraps. These decisions mattered. They shaped scent, they shaped rhythm. They shaped the flow of risk through the camp like the banks of a river shape the current. The fire, for most groups, was central, but not always exactly in the middle. In some sites, hearths are offset slightly from the center of the activity zone. Why? Perhaps to control how the light spread. Firelight reveals as much as it conceals. A predator watching from a distance can learn much from flickering shadows. So placing the fire where it lit the group, but cast little onto the surrounding terrain, may have been a subtle form of camouflage. There's also the question of airflow. Smoke drifts with the wind, and our ancestors likely knew how to read it. placing the hearth so that smoke moved in a predictable direction away from sleeping bodies, away from nearby brush, and toward the assumed approach path of predators, could serve more than comfort. It could carry human scent and ash into the direction of least risk, or toward where an approaching animal might pause, confused. Food, too, was placed deliberately. The butchering of animals was not done at random spots. Bones and hides were often processed outside the main living area, sometimes even on the opposite side of camp from where people slept. This spatial separation helped prevent the buildup of strong odors near the fire or sleeping circle. Even in sites where space was limited, food waste and offal were moved to distinct discard zones areas that often form visible middens in the archaeological record. And then there was waste, not just food, but human. The placement of latrines or defecation areas is not often preserved, but some ethnographic parallels suggest they were kept downwind and downslope whenever possible. In Ice Age sites, we sometimes find concentration zones of phosphate or unusual soil chemistry, a short walk from central hearths, perhaps the ghost traces of these necessary but unspeakable tasks. All of these choices created gradients of scent, heat, and movement, subtle signals that flowed across the camp like invisible threads. And by placing these elements with intention, humans shaped what predators could detect and how close they dared come. Nothing in these camps suggests chaos. On the contrary, the spatial logic implies order, a kind of situational awareness woven into the very soil. And this order wasn't static. As the wind changed, as the herd paths shifted, as the moon waxed and waned, the layout of the camp may have changed, too. Each night a new draft. Each fire a new drawing in the dust. What begins to emerge is a picture not of improvisation, but of design. Not architectural in the way we think of buildings, but architectural in its logic, in its balance, its flow, its repetition. The Ice Age camp was not just a shelter. It was a system of memory, a diagram in space, a story told without words, rebuilt every evening with sticks, fire, and breath. And like any good story, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning was arrival, the quiet ritual of assessment, wind, slope, tracks, water. Then the center was marked, often with fire. Around that the bodies would settle, mats laid down, stones moved just slightly, objects placed within reach. And then the boundaries, bone piles, ash zones, discarded flint, thorns were gently refreshed. Not every night, not with great effort, but with the same kind of subconscious maintenance that we use to straighten a blanket before sleep. In this way, the camp was reformed again and again, a lived structure that required no blueprint. What's striking is how little of this required formal instruction. Children growing up in these groups would have learned the camp layout not from explanation, but from participation. They would have watched where tools were placed, how food was passed, where the elders sat, where the fire was never stepped over. Over time, these behaviors became embedded, not rules but habits, embodied knowledge, passed down like a dance. And that dance was not merely cultural, it was protective. The way one entered the camp may have mattered. Perhaps there was a preferred path in and out, one that curved against the wind or avoided the edge of scent dispersal. Perhaps those who rose to urinate at night stepped wide of the sleeping circle. Perhaps children were scolded, gently or sternly, for scattering bones into the wrong pile. We can't see these interactions, but the spatial consistency hints at shared standards, norms shaped not by arbitrary custom, but by survival. Some archaeologists believe that even the orientation of sleeping bodies may have mattered, heads turned toward the fire, or perhaps outward toward the perimeter, depending on the threat model of the environment. Was someone always half awake? Did certain people, perhaps the youngest and strongest, take the outermost spots, where danger would arrive first? If so, these choices likely became tradition, and, over years, and lifetimes, these traditions hardened into invisible walls. There is a quiet intimacy in this idea that safety came not from controlling the world outside, but from shaping the space within. that the circle in the dust was both a shield and a story. That in the absence of stone houses or tall defenses, what kept people alive was a choreography of warmth, noise, smell, silence, and trust. So the question returns: what then did this structure tell us about the mind behind it? What then did this structure tell us about the mind behind it? It told us that fear was not their guide, foresight was. That safety was not a thing to be built once and forgotten, but something to be composed, like a song, each night anew. The camp was not a fortress. It was a living negotiation between people and place, a rhythm, not a rule. It also told us that vulnerability was understood not as weakness, but as a fact of being alive. Rather than deny that, they planned around it. They slept in rings. They distributed sound and scent. They moved waste and warmth. They placed the fire with intention. And in doing so, they created a kind of collective resilience that did not require domination, only understanding. In this way, the camp was both fragile and strong. Fragile because it could vanish in a day. Strong because it could be rebuilt in an hour. It required no walls. Only people who knew where to place themselves. People who had inherited not just tools and stories, but spatial memory, the ability to feel where something should be, and where it absolutely should not. In the archaeological record, much of this vanishes. We are left with stone chips, charcoal scatters, fragmented bones. But in their arrangement, in their spacing, in their absence, something persists. Not a blueprint, exactly, but a mood. A kind of ghost logic still faintly visible on the earth. There is something profound in the thought that even now, 30,000 years later, we can still detect the outline of their caution, the intelligence of their placement, the care they took with each other's sleep, and perhaps that is the heart of it. This was not just about avoiding lions or wolves. It was about protecting the peace of the night, about creating, in a dangerous world, a space where children could dream, where old people could sigh, where the fire could crackle without anyone watching it, even if only for a few hours. The circle in the dust was not just a structure. It was a statement that we do not have to be alone, that survival is more than escape. It is arrangement, alignment, intimacy, softness, placed precisely. We do not know their names. We do not know the words they whispered across the embers, but we know where they slept, and that is something. Still, the circle was only one part of their toolkit, because sometimes even the best arrangements failed. A scent blew the wrong way. A fire dimmed too soon. The wind shifted, and something came too close. And so the quiet question presses forward once more. What did they do when the edge of the night broke, and the line between watcher and watch dissolved? What weapon, what ritual, what elemental force could keep the darkness from stepping closer? The haunting answer was fire, not simply as warmth or light, but as presence, as a barrier, as a creature in itself. Among all the tools humans carried into the night, fire was the only one that moved and breathed. It crackled. It hissed. It flared with moods. And predators, even the boldest, responded to it with caution. To create fire was to shift the balance, to redraw the edge between prey and hunter. But what made it so powerful? And how did humans learn to wield it? Not just for heat, but for control. The answer may lie in how fire speaks across the senses. It is not just seen. It is heard. It is smelled. It changes the scent profile of everything it touches. Ash clings to the air. Smoke curls through grass and clings to skin. Predators that hunt by scent, wolves, lions, hyenas, rely on a landscape that behaves predictably. Fire disrupts that. It overlays every other signal with its own. From the moment a campfire is lit, the terrain becomes distorted. Scent trails are overwritten. Darkness becomes fragmented. Shadows twitch in strange directions. The human form, once a vulnerable silhouette, is now surrounded by a ring of flickering confusion. The world tilts slightly out of rhythm, and in that tilt, safety is found. Modern ethologists studying predator behavior have noted something remarkable. Even among large carnivores habituated to human presence, fire introduces hesitation. Lions approach slower. Hyenas circle wider. Wolves break formation. It is not just the light they fear, it is the unpredictability. The crackle of embers. The sharp flare when fat hits flame. The way smoke shifts with the wind and renders scent trails useless. For Ice Age humans, this was not just a convenience, it was a revelation. To carry fire was to carry distortion. To sleep near it was to exist inside a sensory echo, a bubble of altered information that predators had to navigate blind. And for many, that was simply too risky. Of course, not all fire is equal. A single ember in the wind is nothing, but a controlled, tended fire one watched, one fed with chosen fuel, one maintained through the night becomes something else entirely. It becomes a signal, a performance. And we have reason to believe this performance was deliberate. In some Ice Age sites, multiple hearths are arranged not randomly, but in clusters or arcs. At Pavlov and Dolny Viestonis, in the Moravian Basin, some dwellings contain evidence of several separate fires, maintained simultaneously, not for cooking, not for light, but perhaps for defense, because to place fire is to shape vision, to manage smoke is to sculpt scent, and to spread embers is to tell the steppe something awake lives here. The glow of fire was only part of the story. Its true power extended into the things it left behind: the smoke that drifted into the night, the ash that coated the earth, the embers that pulsed long after the flame had faded. These were not waste products. They were tools in their own right. Elements of a quiet, sensory architecture that reshaped the risk landscape of the camp. Smoke, in particular, behaved like a signal and a shield. Carried by the wind, it blurred the edges of the human scent. To a predator, smell is not just a detection system, it is a map. It reveals the age of a trail, the direction of a movement, the freshness of a kill. But when smoke clings to skin and fur, and tools and bedding, that map begins to dissolve. And it wasn't just passive. Smoke could be guided. There are clues, both archaeological and ethnographic, that suggest humans may have experimented with different kinds of fuel to produce specific smoke effects. Damp leaves, dung, moss, fat, and even bone all burn differently. Some flare bright, some smolder, some give off dense, acrid plumes that linger low to the ground. It's possible that certain fires were deliberately fed with these materials not for heat, but for confusion, not for light, but for scent saturation. Ash, too, had its uses. Once cooled, it could be handled and spread. Some modern foragers and herders use ash to mask scent on the body, or to lay tracks that interrupt the readability of a trail. Ash dulls odor. It dries moisture. It turns the living ground into a blank page. If Ice Age humans did the same, rubbing ash onto clothing, skin, or tools, it would have further erased their presence from the predator's field of vision. And then there were the embers. In some Ice Age campsites, archaeologists have found small clusters of charred material at the edge of occupation zones. Not full hearths, but ember piles. These may have functioned as boundary markers, quiet flickers placed at the periphery of the camp, too dim to draw attention, too subtle to signal life, but enough to create a glow, a warmth, a message. Something has been here. These ember lines may have been positioned to shape behavior. A predator, approaching from the dark, uncertain of what lay ahead, might pause at the sight of a dull red glimmer. It is not light, but it is not absence. It is ambiguity, and ambiguity is a deterrent. The effect of all this smoke, ash, embers, was to expand the influence of fire beyond the flame, to turn the camp into a kind of living perimeter, one that breathed and shifted with the wind, not a wall, but a veil that did not stop danger outright, but bent it just enough. The physical traces of fire, scattered charcoal, scorched bone, pits lined with stone are among the most durable signatures our ancestors left behind. Long after hides have rotted and words have vanished, the hearth remains. And in that quiet residue, we begin to glimpse not just survival, but intention. What the bones can't tell us, we can only infer. But in certain sites, the story told by the fire is clearer than anywhere else. At Dolní Věstonice, a remarkable Upper Paleolithic settlement in what is now the Czech Republic, researchers have documented multiple hearths arranged in close proximity. These aren't random fire spots. Their consistent spacing, shape, and positioning suggest planning. Some fires seem to have served domestic tasks, cooking, heating, drying hides, while others, positioned on the edges of activity zones, may have had a different role. Perhaps they were perimeter fires, or decoys, or part of a multi-sensory defense system we can barely reconstruct. In the Siberian site of Yana RHS, dating to nearly 30,000 years ago, hearths appear alongside mammoth bone windbreaks and tool caches. What stands out is their clustering, not just one fire at the center, but several, forming a loose network. Some researchers believe these hearths may have been kept smoldering continuously, even while the group moved in and out of the space. Fire, here, was not an event, it was a condition, and fire needed management. Keeping flame alive required more than fuel. It required rhythm, attention. Someone had to watch it, feed it, decide when to let it rise and when to let it fall. A smoldering fire could offer warmth with little light. A roaring blaze could create visibility, but also draw attention. Knowing how to shift between these states, how to tune the fire to the needs of the hour, may have been as important as knowing how to start it in the first place. There are signs that this knowledge was passed on, refined, and formalized. In some sites, stones have been placed around hearths not only to contain the flame, but to reflect heat back into the circle. In others, pits were dug to lower the fire and shield it from the wind or from view. Burn patterns suggest that different kinds of fuel were used at different times. Dry wood for quick heat, dung for long, low smolders, fat for flare-ups. Each material chosen not only for its utility, but for its message, because fire was always sending signals to those nearby and to those watching from the dark. To manage a hearth was to manage a conversation between people, between predators, between past and present. A conversation in light and smoke, in scent and heat, in presence and absence. And what lingers in these traces is not chaos, but choreography. So we begin to wonder, how much of this behavior was ritual, and how much was pure strategy? Perhaps the most powerful aspect of fire was not its physical heat or light, but the illusion it created. Fire could not chase predators away, in the literal sense. It could not strike or roar or run, but it could convince. It could suggest that danger lay elsewhere, that something inside the glow was awake, alert, waiting, and that suggestion may have been enough. Predators are not only hunters of flesh, they are readers of patterns. A lion, before it leaps, calculates. A hyena tests boundaries before it enters. A wolf sends scouts before a full approach. These animals are not reckless. They want assurance. They need a story that ends in success. And fire, in its shifting rhythm, disrupted that narrative. A flickering flame is hard to read. It exaggerates movement. It hides stillness. It plays with shadow. From a distance, the twitch of a hand might look like a hunter's crouch. A log collapsing might sound like speech. The scent of smoke might mask fear with familiarity. To a predator, that uncertainty becomes costly. Every step forward becomes a gamble. In this way, fire became not just a physical tool, but a psychological one. And its effects reached inward too. Within the circle of its light, humans themselves were transformed. The crackling center became a space for memory, for stillness, for slow thought. After the long labor of tracking and building and watching, the fire offered a pause but not a full release. It was a liminal space. 1 foot in safety, 1 foot still listening. There's reason to believe that firelight became the backdrop of early storytelling. The time after dusk, when the camp stilled and predators hovered unseen, may have been when the first myths were shaped, not for entertainment, but for cohesion, for transmitting memory, for reinforcing vigilance. What better way to teach a child about lions than with a tale about a claw in the dark? What better way to warn of the shifting wind than a parable about a scent that betrayed the brave? In this sense, fire became a stage, a place where memory could be passed without having to repeat the danger itself. And perhaps that made it even more powerful, because the true strength of fire may not have been in its flame, but in what it allowed people to imagine. Safety, distance, warning, control. We cannot know exactly how they saw it, but we can observe that nearly every Upper Paleolithic site, no matter how temporary, bears the trace of fire. Even the smallest hunting stations, even the wind-whipped shelters. Someone took the time to ignite, to tend, to place, which leads to a difficult question. Why keep something alive that could not defend you in a fight? Unless, of course, its defense was never physical to begin with. Because fire was not a wall. It could not stop a charging lion, or block a river, or silence the hunger of winter. But what it did was something subtler. It changed the calculus. It interrupted certainty. It gave predators, and perhaps even the people themselves, something to interpret, rather than to fear outright. In that way, fire became a companion to human perception. It gave shape to the invisible. It made presence known, and distance felt. It traced the boundary between where the world ended and the camp began. And it wasn't only at night. Even in daylight, the ashes remained a smear of white across dark earth. The bones charred at their tips, the stones stained with heat. These marks were not just the detritus of survival. They were signatures, traces of decision-making, evidence that someone once chose to say, "This is where we pause. This is where we glow." Some sites show repeated hearths rebuilt in the same place. Again and again the fire pit dug, used, abandoned, then returned to seasons or even years later. There is something powerful in that repetition. It suggests memory. Not just individual memory, but cultural. A memory of space, of wind, of light. The land remembering where the warmth once lived, and the people remembering how to place it there again. This is how fire became more than fuel. It became a relationship, and relationships require care. The fire had to be fed, but not too much. Allowed to breathe, but not to spread. Covered when the wind turned sharp. Nursed back to life with tinder and breath. This care was not transactional. It was emotional. To tend a fire through a freezing night, while others sleep, is not only a task. It is a form of love, of protection, of quiet leadership. And so fire became more than a weapon, more than a perimeter, more than heat. It became a presence, a way of being in the world. To predators, it said, "We are not helpless." To the wind, it said, "Here is warmth." To each other, it said, "I am still here." And perhaps that was the most important thing of all, because even with its scent and sound and smoke, fire could not guarantee safety. It could only increase the odds. But in a world where danger was constant, increasing the odds was enough. The weapon that glows is still with us, in our memory, in our rituals, in the way we gather around light even now, instinctively. Not just for vision but for feeling. But fire was only part of the defense, because when the eyes of predators watched from the darkness, it wasn't just light that pushed them back. It was sound. So how did our ancestors use song, rhythm, and voice itself to hold the line not with weapons but with air? What kind of sound could keep a predator at bay without ever being seen? There is something strange and powerful about the human voice in darkness. When vision fades, sound becomes everything. It maps space. It signals life. It confuses direction. And when used deliberately, not in fear, but in rhythm, it becomes a kind of echo armor, a soft perimeter that moves as the people do. Somewhere in the deep past, humans discovered that sound could behave like scent and light. It could announce presence, define boundaries, and suggests strength even when there was none, not through shouting or panic, but through rhythm. And so we find ourselves imagining the night camp, long after firelight has burned low. Somewhere, someone begins to hum, a low, continuous tone, not loud, not for others, exactly, just to say, I am still awake, I am still here. Then a rattle, made of bone, or gourd, or stone. It's rolled or shaken once, twice. It clacks, then stills. Somewhere else, another sound follows. Maybe a whispered phrase, repeated. A breath drawn sharp and let out slow. None of this is chaotic. It is measured, intuitive. Like the fire, it is not aimed to attack, but to surround. Ethnographers working with present-day hunter-gatherer groups have observed this behavior in forms that feel timeless. Among the Juhuansi in southern Africa, families often fall asleep to soft, spoken chants and rhythmic stories. Not for children alone, but for the entire group. The Hadza of Tanzania use low hums and repeated melodic calls when walking through tall grass, especially when they know predators may be near. In the highlands of Papua, some tribes hang objects that rattle in the wind-dried pods, woven shells not to frighten animals with volume, but to suggest motion, suggest life. These are not shouts, not alarms. They are invitations to reconsider, because in the mind of a predator, silence is confidence. The prey that stays still, that hides its breath, may be cornered, but noise calm, strange, non-panicked speaks of something else. A creature not afraid to be known, a group that does not startle, and in that, there is danger. Of course, we cannot directly hear the voices of Paleolithic people. Their instruments, if they had them, were often made of fragile materials. What remains are clues: a pierced phalanx bone from Isturitz, dated to more than 20,000 years ago, shaped like a flute. Grooved stones from the Gravettian layers in Central Europe, possibly used as rasps. Even the foot bones of reindeer, known to rattle when dried and strung, found scattered near hearths. And then there are the echoes left in sleep. What kind of world sings not to celebrate, but to survive? A world in which sound becomes a shield. A world where the night is not filled with silence, but with patterns, pulses of human presence designed to bend the rules of fear. Rhythm, in this context, is not for art, it is for control. Repetition gives structure to the unknown. A voice that repeats the same tone every few breaths is not accidental. It is a marker. It says, this space is watched, this space is claimed. Within the sleeping circle, this repetition may have taken many forms. A story spoken not once, but over and over again, in the same tone. A song that doesn't build, but loops. Not to entertain. To hold the air steady. To keep breath in motion. Because when breath stops, danger notices. In many modern hunter-gatherer groups, the night is when the most important stories are told. But unlike theatrical performances, these are quiet, low, repetitive. They are not shouted across the campfire. They are spoken like weaving a thread moving through the minds of those who listen. And they serve more than cultural memory. They hold attention. They reduce anxiety. And perhaps most importantly, they keep people awake. To remain vigilant through long hours of darkness is no small task. It is easy to fall into stillness. But sound, especially when shared, keeps the body in motion. A whispered story passed between two speakers, a rhythm tapped on a log, the sound of someone stirring embers or cracking bone. These are not random. They are the thin barrier that stands between the group and what watches from the grass. We also begin to understand that sound did not need to be constant. It needed to be intermittent enough to create the impression of wakefulness, even when most were asleep. If a predator approached the camp and heard a sudden rattle, a burst of laughter, a few muttered words, it would assume someone was awake. And that might be enough. Even the construction of tools and shelters could have been designed with sound in mind. A suspended ornament made of bone that clinked in the breeze. A hanging strand of shells that whispered against hide. These were not alarms in the modern sense, but they may have been enough to give predators pause, or enough to wake the lightest sleeper at the edge of the ring. To live like this was to live not in fear, but in rhythm. Fear is frantic. Rhythm is planned. It repeats. It endures. It adapts. And in this repetition, we find a different kind of weapon, not one forged in stone, but in the space between voices. That space, that delicate interval may have mattered more than we realize. In the cold, flat vastness of the Mammoth Steppe, where sound carried across kilometers of open grass, every noise became part of a conversation with the dark. And so, humans learned to shape not just what they said, but when they said it. Timing mattered, terrain mattered, season mattered. On still nights, when the air was dense and dry, sound traveled farther. A single crack of bone underfoot might echo like a warning drum. In those moments, silence was not absence. It was a lure, a trap for listening ears. So the people whispered, shifted softly, let the fire hum in their place. And then, just when the tension stretched too thin, they made a sound. A deliberate one, a cough, a footfall, a short clicking rhythm. It broke the silence like a knife. It told the listener, I know you're there. Predators, especially those that stalk at night, rely on predictability. They look for weakness, for routine, for sleep. But a group that controls its sound, that uses silence as bait and rhythm as signal, that group is harder to read, harder to approach. This wasn't just noise, it was strategy. And in many parts of the world, it still is. Among the San peoples of the Kalahari, hunters mimic the calls of animals not to attract them, but to confuse listening predators. The Kung use quiet hand-clapping patterns during nighttime walks to signal position to others without revealing exact location. In the Arctic, some Inuit groups have used throat singing not only as entertainment, but as a way to keep rhythm during dangerous travels in low-visibility terrain. These practices are not performances. They are tools, passed down with care, taught not in words, but in presence. A child hears the same chant repeated by their mother, the same click of stone against shell, the same way a man pauses before making the call that announces his return to camp. These are the sonic habits of people who have lived close to danger for a long, long time. It is very likely that Ice Age humans had similar codes. Not formal languages, perhaps, but patterned sounds, repeated sequences, rhythms that only meant something if you knew the land. A call that echoed like a bird, but wasn't. A laugh that rose high at the end, signaling safety. A name that could be whispered across a frozen river without waking a bear. Sound was not decoration, it was orientation, it was placement, it was survival. And so, every night, the camp filled with small, deliberate noise, even while people slept, because as long as the air carried a pattern, the predators paused. And just as importantly, so did the people. Not into stillness, but into alignment. Rhythmic sound didn't only ward off threats from outside, it also calmed the body within. In a world where nerves had to stay alert, yet not fray, sound became a kind of tuning fork for the nervous system. A low chant, a steady knock, a hum beneath breath. These were not just signs to others, they were signals to the self. It's easy to overlook how much mental energy survival required, especially at night, when the eyes see little and the mind begins to wander. To keep one's awareness sharp without slipping into fear, that is a balancing act. And rhythm helped carry it. Imagine a group of 20 humans in a wind-swept hollow, sleeping in a ring around low embers. One person shifts, and another clicks tongue to teeth. A third murmurs a name, not out of fear, but simply to affirm the shape of things. These noises flutter and fall, like birds over water, nothing loud, but enough. In that web of low sound, people hear each other. They feel less alone, and that may have been just as critical as the fire or the spear, because fear isolates, but rhythm synchronizes. This idea is echoed in studies of modern-day communal sleepers. Groups that sleep together often regulate their movements and breathing in ways that reduce the chance of full awakening. One person stirs, the others respond subtly, unconsciously, a sigh, a roll, a click of the tongue, and then stillness again. The same may have been true of sound among early humans. It wasn't just for scaring lions, it was for tethering minds. Tethering, not controlling. These weren't militarized camps. No one issued orders, but through repeated practice nightly, seasonally, generationally, people learned how to keep the camp in tune. Not perfectly, not always, but enough to keep the group from sliding into chaos when the dark pressed close. This may be why even today, in entirely different environments, people still reach for rhythmic sound in moments of uncertainty. A lullaby in a hospital, a whispered prayer in a storm, a soft knock on wood when stepping into the unknown. These are not superstitions, they are echoes, shadows of ancient strategies that helped us sleep among predators without losing our humanity. So we begin to see the full shape of it. Fire bent the night into a glow. Sound filled it with breath. And between those two, light and voice, the human animal staked its claim to stillness. But not all noise was soft, because sometimes the message had to be loud, not constant, not chaotic, but sudden, measured, designed to break rhythm rather than create it. When the soft hums and quiet patterns failed to keep the watchers at bay, humans turned to something older still, the sharpness of sound. A rattle shaken once with force, a stone struck hard against another, a sudden whoop that bounced off frozen trees. These were not cries of panic, they were instruments of decision. It's in this suddenness that we glimpse another layer of auditory defense, the strategic disruption, the controlled burst. These sounds did not simply warn, they confused. To a predator, the difference between prey and threat is speed of response. A startled animal bolts, a prepared animal explodes. And humans learned, through trial and through time, that a sudden noise could halt a charge, scatter a formation, or stall a creeping shape in the tall grass. And so their toolkit expanded: bone clappers, wooden drums, bundles of antlers that clacked when swung, fire-hardened sticks that snapped with a sharp crack. Even the human voice, raised to a sudden pitch, fractured into staccato calls, became a force, not to sing, but to shock. These were not meant to carry melodies. They carried decisions. In the archaeological record, some of these tools are guessed at, rather than found. Perforated antlers, etched bone fragments that seem worn by repeated contact, charred hollows in wood that may have served as resonators, and in some Ice Age burials, especially those of women and children, beads, rattles, and pendants that may have doubled as sound makers, carried for more than beauty. Sound, in this sense, was both shield and sword, and what made it powerful was its intentionality. Humans didn't simply make noise, they made meaning. Even in defense, there was structure, silence, rhythm, story, rattle, shout, each layered atop the other, like concentric circles of presence. And through it all, the predators listened, calculated, chose, not always in favor of the humans. Attacks still happened. Death was still part of the landscape. But more often than not, the line held, because they had built it not with bricks or blades, but with breath. And in that fragile wall of sound, there was something quietly defiant, a refusal to be voiceless, a refusal to be silent prey. But what happens when noise isn't used for warning? What happens when sound itself becomes the weapon not to keep danger away but to turn it around? Because in the wild, confusion is power. And the next tool was not rhythm, it was rupture, disruption, misdirection, a new art, still made of sound, but no longer for singing. Now, we step into the sudden world of shock, and the weapon is surprise. But even surprise wears a scent. Long before teeth meet skin or fire meets fur, something else touches the predator first. a trail in the air, a wisp of skin, a molecule of breath. To the lions, wolves, and hyenas of the Ice Age, this was the world's true language. Not sound, not shape, but scent. And it is here, in this invisible terrain, that early humans found one of their greatest challenges and most subtle defenses, because to survive, they didn't just have to be smart. They had to become unreadable. The predators of the Pleistocene hunted with noses, honed over millions of years. A lion can track prey for hours by a trail invisible to us. A hyena can locate a carcass days old from over a kilometer away. Wolves navigate a scent map that tells them who passed by, how recently, in what state of health. To move through this world without becoming a target, humans had to learn to manipulate the message their bodies sent into the air. And so, they turned to the tools the land provided: ash, dung, hide, and blood. Ash was more than the remains of fire. It was a soft, fine powder that clung to skin and clothing. It dulled the scent of sweat. It masked the oils of the body. It changed the way humans registered on the sensory grid of a hunting cat. When rubbed on the arms, legs, and face, ash became an eraser. It didn't eliminate presence. It disrupted pattern. Dung, too, had its place. Though repellent to us, it was familiar to animals. In some regions, humans are still known to step in or smear dried dung deliberately, not out of desperation, but as a masking strategy. If a predator expects the smell of prey and instead finds only the scent of herbivore waste, confusion follows. The predator pauses, questions, waits, and that hesitation may be enough. The idea was not to disappear entirely. That was impossible. The idea was to fracture the trail, to turn the predator's certainty into uncertainty. Even the layout of campsites may have reflected this awareness. Latrines or waste zones, if they existed, were likely placed downwind, well away from the sleeping ring. Ash pits, bone dumps, discarded hides, all may have been positioned to draw attention away, to create a false story on the wind. A ghost scent that said, "Here is movement, but not here, not now." It's a strategy echoed in many indigenous hunting practices today, where masking scent is not superstition, but a core part of preparation. Mud on the hands, crushed leaves behind the ears, smoke blown into clothing. These are techniques rooted in the understanding that smell is not background. It is the map, and to survive, our ancestors had to redraw it, not with ink, not with words, but with skin, because it wasn't enough to mask the scent of a human. Sometimes the strategy was to become something else entirely. One of the most ancient techniques found across cultures separated by oceans and millennia was the rubbing of the body with earth, not just for warmth, not for ornament, but for invisibility. Mud, when fresh, carries the scent of mineral stillness. It absorbs sweat. It coats the skin in a layer that reads like silence. On a body moving through tall grass, this thin film disrupted the olfactory footprint. It wasn't about becoming invisible. It was about becoming unreadable, and there were more extreme methods. Animal fat scraped from the carcass of a deer, mammoth, or bison was sometimes smeared onto the body. The smell was pungent, but not alarming. A predator picking up that trail might think a kill had already occurred, that the meal had been taken, or worse, that the territory belonged to something larger, hungrier, more dangerous than it. In some cases, humans wore the hides of animals not only for warmth but for scent. A freshly skinned pelt carries with it the full chemical signature of the beast: blood, glandular oils, soil from the animal's last rest. When dried properly, it becomes neutral, but in those first hours worn still damp, hair side out, it speaks to the wind in the voice of a different species. There is an eerie intimacy in this practice. To carry the smell of another animal, to blend your scent with its death, is not just camouflage, it is transformation. You become a question rather than an answer, a figure whose trail does not match its stride, and predators hesitate before answering questions. Some anthropologists believe these techniques were also used in reverse, not just to hide from predators, but to lure prey. A hunter masked in mud and blood might move downwind of reindeer without being noticed, or approach a carcass that hyenas had abandoned, hoping to retrieve bone, sinew, or tool material. It was not just about survival, it was about access, but the most chilling tactic was the deliberate use of decay. It's been proposed that early humans may have placed decomposing remains near their camps, not close enough to pollute the living space, but near enough to serve as a boundary. A scent wall. Most predators avoid the scent of long dead flesh. It speaks of disease, danger, defeat. To place such a marker between the camp and the wild was a way of saying, "There is nothing for you here." A lie, perhaps, but a useful one, because in this world, where everything hunts, even a lie made of scent could be a weapon. But it worked both ways. Just as humans learned to mask themselves, they also learned to read. The scent of others, especially predators, became a kind of language, a trail left in the air, waiting to be interpreted. Smell was not just a warning. It was a map of movement. The dung of a lion told more than just location. Its freshness indicated time. The direction of the wind told whether the cat was moving toward the river or away. A flattened patch of grass, soaked with musk, meant resting place. A series of scent marks near a ridge suggested territorial patrolling. Each trace gave information not just about where the predator was, but about how it thought, what it expected, what it feared. To survive among these apex hunters, humans didn't just run from danger. They plotted around it. They knew when to avoid a thicket, even if it offered shelter. They learned to move against the wind when lion scent thickened in the air. They delayed a water run if hyena musk was found at the edges of a bend. These decisions were not always dramatic. Often, they were quiet, a nod, a gesture, a change in path, and the knowledge was shared in whispers, in glances, in stories told over firelight. There's reason to believe that even children learned these patterns early. A young child might be shown how to recognize the difference between deer droppings and feline scat, might be taught to notice when the air smelled wrong before the group entered a new valley. This was not education in the modern sense. It was survival embedded in attention. Some evidence suggests that humans also used predator scent against other predators. Hyenas, for example, are fiercely territorial. The scent of one clan may deter another. It's possible that humans discovered this and learned to harvest or relocate dung piles as a kind of biological fence, a trick, a bluff, a signal saying, "This ground is already claimed." We see similar behavior in modern subsistence cultures. Some East African herders burn dried dung at the edges of night enclosures to confuse the scent trails of their cattle. In the Andean highlands, alpaca herders scatter ash and urine around sleeping grounds, not for cleanliness, for misdirection. It is not so different from the Ice Age, a sleeping circle arranged near a smouldering pit. The scent of burned fat in the air, a wind that carries away the breath of the camp and replaces it with the ghosts of antelope and ash. In such a place, smell becomes both shield and signal, and those who survive are those who know how to listen with their nose, because scent is more than utility, it is memory. Long before humans wrote words or carved symbols, they remembered the world by how it smelled: the sour musk of cave bear scat, the sweetness of crushed pine needles, the copper tang of blood cooling in snow. Each odor told a story not in language, but in feeling. And feelings, unlike facts, do not fade so quickly. Ash, in particular, became one of the great anchoring scents of human life. Every night it was there on the skin, in the wind, between the teeth. It clung to sleeping mats. It colored the edges of memory. And in that way, it may have become something deeper than a tool. It became the scent of safety, which is why we see traces of it far beyond the hearth, scattered through burial sites, sprinkled over offerings, pressed into fingerprints on cave walls. Ash was more than a byproduct of fire. It was presence, a way to mark that humans had been there. That breath had warmed this stone, that voices had once filled this hollow, and scent marked more than people. It marked time, The arrival of spring smelled of thawing soil and wet fur. Autumn, of dried grass and distant smoke. These patterns were not poetic, they were navigational. They told humans when to move, where to settle, which trails to follow. The world changed not only in light and shape, but in scent. And the predators changed with it. In cold months, the air held scent longer. Trails clung to snow. Musk hardened in frost. Predators grew bolder in hunger, and the lines between hunter and hunted blurred. In such seasons, scent became a field of tension, thick, braided, alive. Every step stirred a warning. Humans responded with vigilance. They burned dung to confuse the wind. They dug waste pits farther from camp. They rolled in smoke before sleep. They chewed bark that altered body odor, rinsed hides in ash water, buried meat deep beneath layered soil. Nothing was left to chance. And yet, they still walked through it, through the valley that smelled of death, through the forests that reeked of leopard and lynx, through the bones and the blood and the rot, because to live was to learn the terrain of the nose, and to survive was to shape it. Even today, there are places that seem to carry the breath of that past. A cave that smells of soot, a field that holds the faint odor of charred grass. These are not accidents, they are echoes. Olfactory ruins. A whisper from the Mammoth Steppe that says, "We passed through here. We knew this air." And in that whisper is something else. A question. What happens when the line of scent is broken? When smell turns not to warning, but to confusion? Then the rules of the hunt begin to unravel. And this, too, was something early humans learned to wield. If scent could signal presence, then it could also suggest false presence. A shadow, a double, a misplaced trail designed not to hide, but to mislead. Some camps may have scattered animal remains not only to mask human odor, but to create the illusion of abundance elsewhere. A pile of old meat or bones, left in a shallow gully, could draw predators away from the true camp. If the wind was right, it might pull a hyena pack in the opposite direction for an entire night. This was more than masking. It was redirection, a quiet decoy. The scent of a carcass is like a bell to a carnivore, and Ice Age humans understood this. By using it with precision, placing scent markers along false paths, dropping waste at the edge of less used trails, even dragging hides in looping patterns, they shaped a false story on the wind. The predators would follow it as they had always done, noses close to the ground, reading the trail like a script. But the script was fiction. In this way, the human camp became more than a cluster of bodies around a fire. It became a node of invisible architecture, not built with wood or stone, but with molecules, with wind, with time. The camp existed not only in the visible world but in the olfactory one, layered with signals both true and false. The space was defended not just by ash and spear, but by the stories it told in scent. We often think of ancient survival as reactive, hiding, running, fighting. But scent manipulation was proactive. It required forethought. To smear dung on a trail is to think of what might happen in 6 hours. To dig a waste pit where the wind won't carry it to a sleeping circle is to predict the direction of scent before it travels. These were calculations performed not with numbers, but with memory and instinct, and they were shared knowledge passed from older hunters to younger, from mother to child, encoded in gesture, in practice, in the long repetition of seasons. And yet, even the most carefully laid scent boundaries had their limits. The wind shifts, the rain falls. A predator too hungry to be fooled crosses the line. There was never full safety, only reduction of risk. So the scent map was always evolving, rewritten with each migration, reshaped by new terrain, relearned each time a fire was lit in unfamiliar land. But humans weren't always alone in their strategies. They were not the only species playing with scent, with sound, with space. Some allies had paws. Some had ears keener than our own. Some could smell danger before it arrived, and raise their own alarms. And sometimes, those alarms came not from human voices, but from animals who had learned to listen. So what kind of bond begins when two predators, once rivals, choose not to fear each other? Across the wind-carved steppe, and the glacial valleys beyond, there were moments rare, fragile, fleeting when a wolf did not flee, when a human did not lift a spear, when both stood close enough to smell each other's breath and chose stillness instead of violence. We do not know exactly when the first of these moments occurred, but we know they happened, because the echoes are still there in the bones, in the genomes, in the shadows cast by firelight. Roughly 30,000 years ago, something began to change in the relationship between wolves and humans, not all at once, not everywhere, but in scattered pockets across the northern hemisphere. Certain wolves began to behave differently. They hovered at the edges of human camps, not stalking, but waiting, not attacking, but watching. These weren't tame animals. Not yet. But something was shifting. Some threshold was being tested. We can only guess what the first humans thought when they saw yellow eyes glowing just outside the fire's reach. Did they see threat? Did they sense possibility? Did they throw a bone not in anger, but in invitation? We don't know. But the evidence suggests that a small subset of wolves and a small subset of humans began to circle each other in a slow, spiraling dance of coexistence. The bones tell part of the story. At sites like Goyet Cave in Belgium, a skull was found broad-snouted, heavy-jawed, not quite wolf, not quite dog. Its teeth showed wear patterns inconsistent with pure scavenging. Radiocarbon dated to roughly 31,000 years ago, it stands as one of the earliest indicators of something different. Not domestication, not yet, but proximity. Tolerance, a shift in the perimeter between wild and human. Genetics gives us another clue. Modern domestic dogs share ancestry with a now extinct population of ancient wolves. These weren't the same wolves that survived into recent centuries. They were a branch that disappeared, perhaps because they gave themselves over to something new. The first dogs did not descend from the strongest, most aggressive predators. They likely came from the wolves that lingered, those curious enough, or cautious enough, to stay just beyond the fire's edge without bolting. The process was not deliberate. It was not a project. It was an unfolding, slow, mutual, unconscious. But something profound was beginning. A new category of being was emerging. Not fully human, not fully wolf, something in between. Something shaped by hunger, by caution, by the warmth of fire, and by the rhythm of footsteps side by side in the snow. And what both sides seemed to understand was that survival could be shared. At first, the relationship was likely silent. No commands, no collars, just the slow study of each other's movements. The humans watched the wolves watched the humans. They followed similar trails, hunted the same prey, moved through the same forests and over the same ice-blown hills. They knew the same smells: blood, ash, wind, rot. They listened for the same sounds: cracking branches, rustling grass, the breathing of things just out of sight. And somewhere, in that overlap, something opened. It likely began with scraps, a few leftover bones tossed toward the edge of camp, fatty bits from a kill too rich for preservation. The humans didn't give them out of charity. They gave them because it was easier to discard waste than bury it. But to the wolves that hovered just beyond the light, this was an invitation, not just to food but to pattern. They learned the rhythms of human camps. When meals ended, when silence settled, when it was safe to approach, and when it wasn't. And the humans, in turn, began to notice something too. The wolves alerted early. Long before a human heard the crack of twigs or the low growl of something approaching, the wolves had already bristled, already turned their heads, already stood with ears forward, tails stiff, noses to the air. Their bodies responded to danger before it arrived. This sensitivity, this edge of awareness, became part of the camp's atmosphere, even without intention. The wolves were becoming sentinels. They didn't protect the humans. Not yet. But their presence altered the way the night felt. They created a buffer zone, not physical, but sensory. Other predators might pause when they smelled wolf scent near a campfire. Other scavengers might hesitate when they heard a low snarl in the dark. It wasn't that the wolves had become friends. It was that their presence began to shift the calculus of risk. And as these patterns continued, something deeper began to form. Some wolves grew bolder. They came closer, not to challenge but to rest. They lay just beyond the smoke ring, curled beside discarded hides, watched with eyes half-lidded, while humans told stories and sharpened tools. And among the humans, especially the young, there was wonder. A child might throw a bone not just as disposal, but as play. An elder might speak aloud to the same shadow every night, giving it a name. The wolves, for their part, learned faces, smells, voices. They began to recognize who fed them and who did not. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was attention. Repeated, rhythmic, mutual. And in that repetition, the first threads of relationship were spun, not from obedience, but from observation. Not from dominance, but from parallel need. And when the snow deepened and food grew scarce, they still lingered. Not all wolves stayed, but a few did. And from those few, something ancient and quiet began to unfold. In the snow-silenced world of the late Pleistocene, survival was not just about hunting well or hiding fast. It was about managing energy. Every step, every breath, every fire lit or left to smolder, all of it mattered. And the wolves who lingered near the human camps were doing what humans themselves had learned to do: conserve. They stayed close not just for food, but for warmth. A large wolf's coat is thick, but not infinite. Nights on the Mammoth Steppe could plunge well below freezing. A sleeping wolf nestled close to the edge of a campfire's radiant heat might rest more deeply than one exposed to the open wind. And while most would not have dared step within the human ring, some did, especially the younger ones, the lean, cautious bodies with eyes wide and ears tucked. They may have crept closer than the rest, curling behind firewood piles or abandoned skins, learning not just human scent but human sleep. The humans noticed. They may have tolerated it at first, a quiet guest who kept other threats at bay. But gradually, some camps began to adjust around the presence of these canines. Skins laid near hearths might no longer be for drying. A bit of fat left on a bone might be spared on purpose. Not always. Not everywhere. But in small ways, the behavior of one species began to shape the habits of another. It wasn't a one-sided generosity. The wolves gave more than they took. At the first sign of movement in the dark, they would rise. Before a human stirred, they were standing silent, stiff-legged, alert. A rustle of tall grass, the faint grind of claws on frozen dirt. These were things a wolf heard faster than any human ear. The sound might have drawn the whole camp to readiness. Spears gripped. Children hushed. Eyes narrowed at the fire's edge. But the first signal came from the wolves. In this way, they became an early warning system, not because they had been trained, because they were wild, because their bodies were wired to respond, and the humans learned to listen. Over time, these instincts may have shaped the very structure of sleep. Some people watched the dark with eyes, others listened with ears, and now, some sensed with noses they did not own. The humans were not alone in their defense. The circle had widened, and there were other advantages. Scavenging, for instance, became shared. A wolf could find the scent of a wounded animal long before a human could. They could track trails that had grown cold, uncover caches hidden under snow, follow vultures into ravines no person dared descend. And the humans, watching them, began to learn, began to follow back. The wolves had become guides, even if neither side spoke a word, and still they stayed. Through snowstorms, through lean seasons, through migrations and firelit nights, the wolves remained close, not as pets, not as tools, but as something else, something nameless and ancient, a presence both wild and known. The lines between categories began to blur. Was this animal still a threat? Was it simply tolerated? Or had it become something more? We do not have the words those humans used, but their actions speak. Some of the earliest burials in Eurasia include not only humans, but canines. At Předmostí, in the Czech Republic, a skull was found with a worn tooth and deliberate placement evidence. perhaps, of a creature that had lived long and died close to humans. At Elisiavich in Russia, a large, broad-skulled canid was interred in a position suggesting care. These animals were not discarded. They were placed, chosen, remembered, and from memory, relationship deepens. For children, especially, the presence of a young wolf, not threatening, not distant, must have stirred something instinctive: curiosity, laughter, the impulse to touch. A pup licking grease from a child's fingers, a child mimicking its howl. These moments may have been fleeting, but over time they built something solid, something that lasted across generations. Some researchers believe the process of early domestication may have been driven partly by emotion, not just utility. A child who bonds with a wolf pup may be more likely to protect it. A group that sees the animal not only as a scavenger, but as part of the camp, may treat it differently, feed it differently, defend it differently. And the wolves, attuned as they are to social dynamics and emotion, responded in kind. This was never about command. It was about presence. The animals that stayed were not submissive. They were adaptable. They had learned, through observation and proximity, how to live beside humans without triggering fear or aggression. And the humans, in turn, adapted to them. They softened in some ways, hardened in others. They began to carry not just tools and memories but living companions, and the change was mutual. Wolves that remained near humans began to shift in subtle ways. Some grew smaller, with narrower skulls and less aggressive jaws. Their social rhythms changed not overnight, but across generations. They barked more, howled less. They bred at different times. They became more sensitive to human gesture, human voice, human stillness. In this slow exchange of traits, a new creature began to form. Not wolf, not yet dog, but something in between. Something watching the same fire, listening to the same wind, walking beside the same footprints in the snow, and behind it all, a quiet, almost impossible question. What does it mean when a predator chooses not to kill? What does it mean when two species, shaped by competition, begin to weave their lives together, not by force, but by familiarity? And what changes when that familiarity becomes trust? For a long time, nothing changes at all. The wolves still pace at the edge of the camp. The humans still watch with caution. But one night, the boundary is crossed. A pup is allowed near the fire. A carcass is shared without a chase. A warning bark is taken seriously. These moments are not loud. They do not announce themselves. But over years, decades, centuries they accumulate. The world begins to reshape itself. Quietly, we often imagine domestication as a single moment. A wolf kneeling before a human. A collar slipped over a neck. But the truth is less clear and far more beautiful. It was not obedience that created the first dogs. It was coexistence. Not dominance, but drift. Not a taming, but a staying. The wolves who stayed were not chosen. They chose themselves. Chose to linger, to observe, to accept a different kind of life. One tied not to a pack of kin, but to a pack of strangers who made fire, who sang, who buried their dead and painted animals on stone. And in turn, humans were changed. To live beside a predator is to think differently about the night, about the sharpness of sound, about the meaning of silence. The wolves taught them what fear smells like, what hunger feels like, what loyalty without language looks like. They taught them to listen with their whole bodies, not to words, but to presence. And in time, those teachings became habits. Habits became culture. Culture became memory. And memory lives on. We still feel it, thousands of years later, in the shape of a sleeping dog curled near a hearth. In the reflex to look where it looks, to rise when it growls, to calm when it sleeps. These instincts are old, older than civilization, older than farming. They belong to a time when the line between survival and death was drawn in bone and ash. But what matters most is not the moment that line was crossed. It is that someone crossed it and never went back. Somewhere on the steppe, there was a fire. Around it, the human ring curled tight. Just beyond, a small shape watched. Not hunting, not hiding, just waiting. And someone, a child, maybe noticed, offered a scrap, held out a hand, and the world tilted slightly. Forever. In that moment, a predator did not disappear. It became something else. It became a partner. It became a guardian. It became a friend. And from that firelight, a new path opened, one not built on isolation, but on cooperation. Because in the Ice Age, no one survived alone. And no one slept without watching the dark. To lie down in a world of predators was not an act of recklessness, but of calculation. Sleep was not passive. It was guarded, negotiated, shaped by understanding not only of the land, but of the minds that moved through it. To survive the night, humans had to become students of the unseen, not just of tracks and wind, but of intention, of rhythm, of hunger. It wasn't enough to fear lions. You had to think like one. The people of the Mammoth Steppe were not the only ones who shaped their sleep around danger. The danger shaped itself around them. The lion did not stalk blindly. It waited. It chose. It studied. It learned the difference between a herd of bison and a ring of humans. It learned the places where fire meant territory and the places where silence meant opportunity. The lion was not mindless. It was strategic. So humans adapted their strategy in turn. They learned that lions prefer to strike from downwind, that their eyes are sharp in low light, but vulnerable to flickering motion, that their patience is finite, they'll wait for a weak opening, but lose interest when nothing moves, that they test the edge of the camp, not with a charge, but with stillness, watching, listening, letting their presence settle into the air until fear begins to rise in the body. And it wasn't just lions. Hyenas had a different logic. They were brazen. They tested boundaries constantly. They didn't fear fire the same way. They laughed in the dark, a sound that carried like mockery across the wind, and moved in packs with a rhythm that was hard to predict. Cave bears were slower, more solitary, driven less by hunger than by surprise. To stumble upon one near its den was not an ambush, but an accident. And wolves, those who had not stayed still, operated with a kind of cautious intelligence that mirrored the human hunt. They, too, knew the signs of sleep, the shifting of bodies, the softening of breath. So the humans learned, to sleep was to enter a contract with the unknown, and the terms of that contract were written in animal logic. Children learned to recognize the sounds of different footsteps in the night. Adults studied scat, not just for freshness, but for emotional state, the difference between calm, foraging, and stressed movement. A sudden silence in the woods meant more than noise. It meant something had stopped moving, something listening, calculating. And when a shape emerged at the edge of camp, the question was not only, what is it? But, what does it want? What does it know? And what would I do if I were it? This was not a question of fear. It was a discipline, a nightly exercise in prediction. Before the body could rest, the mind had already run the path of the predator, testing angles of approach, wind direction, cover, sound. To sleep on the Mammoth Steppe was to become part of a living simulation, a layered awareness shaped not by paranoia, but by pattern. Some of this knowledge came through direct encounter. A missed hunt, a stolen kill, the loss of a companion. These left marks deeper than scars. They shaped memory, and memory shaped behavior. But much of it came through observation. The same way a child learned how to shape sinew into thread, they learned how lions walked into the wind. They learned where hyenas gathered bones. They learned the rhythm of owl calls, and what it meant when the rhythm stopped. Across generations, this became cultural knowledge passed down not in books, but in gestures, in sleeping arrangements, in the invisible choreography of the night. Even the placement of fires reflected this understanding. A single fire burned hot, but it cast long shadows. Multiple small hearths spread the light more evenly. reduced the contrast that predators used to their advantage. Fires were placed not just for heat, but for sight lines, to eliminate blind zones, to push the boundary of visibility just far enough that a lion's approach became readable, the twitch of an ear, the ripple of muscle before a charge. The same was true of sleeping positions. The ringed formation we've already seen, bodies arranged in a circle, heads inward, feet out, wasn't just for warmth. It was tactical. In this formation, every sleeper became a sensor. A ripple of movement, a sudden breath, a startled sound would travel through the ring like a signal, waking the group in layered waves. No one needed to stay fully awake all night if the structure itself was designed to respond. This is what it means to think like the predator, to know how it sees you, how it smells you, how it weighs the risk of attack, and then calmly, precisely to build your rest around that knowledge, not to fight it, not to flee it, but to live within it. There is an elegance to this way of thinking, a kind of intelligence that goes unrecognized in modern life. Today we associate sleep with peace, vulnerability, safety. But in the deep past, sleep was an achievement, something earned through attentiveness, design, and a deep understanding of the animal mind. And perhaps most remarkable of all, they did not simply learn what the predators feared. They learned what the predators respected. Movement without panic, stillness without submission. A gaze returned, a perimeter held. Not dominance, not aggression, just enough awareness to convince a lion that this prey is not worth the risk. That was the goal, to tip the scale. Not by building walls, not by outmuscling a creature twice your size, but by becoming legible to it in a way that said, "I see you, I know how you think, and I am not afraid." This was not a challenge. It was a message. A message carried in posture, in placement, in silence. And to send that message clearly, humans had to know their audience, to see the night as the lion sees it, to smell a fire not just as warmth, but as a mask, to read the angle of a camp's entry path from the low stalker's eye, to anticipate when a scavenger might test the circle not based on the moon phase or the clock, but on the availability of meat, the pressure of recent hunts, the wind's softness, the presence of pups in a rival den miles away. This is not instinct alone. This is cognition, the kind of thinking that grows out of many nights, lived close to danger, without the shield of walls or weapons strong enough to guarantee victory. It is the thinking of a species that survived, not because it was the strongest, but because it was the most attentive. And that attention became habitual, even when no predator was near. The signs were still red. The grass that bent a little too recently. The pause in the insect's drone. The faint scrape of something hard against stone. These details passed unnoticed by animals who relied solely on speed or strength. But to humans, they were data. They were signals that shaped when the group would sleep, where the children would be placed, when to feed the fire again, when to trust the silence, and when not to. There is a reason many animals sleep alone, or in burrows, or up high in trees. But humans slept on open ground, because they had made the terrain itself an extension of their thinking. Their sleep was a woven thing made of soil, wind, memory, and map, and woven into it was the awareness of every eye that might be watching them from beyond the firelight. We often forget this heritage. In the softness of modern rooms, in the hum of distant highways, in the comfort of locked doors and alarm clocks, we forget that sleep was once a tactical act. A moment when the line between dreamer and hunter was not drawn by walls, but by wits, and those who survived were those who could enter the mind of the one who circled them, to anticipate, with eerie clarity, what they would do if they smelled ash and heard breath. That was the art, the quiet calculus of the Ice Age night. And it required something rare, a form of empathy that reached beyond species, not a softness, not affection, but a cold, clear alignment of perspective, the kind of empathy that says, "I know what you are, because I have become you in my mind. I've walked your path. I've felt your ribs against your skin. I've seen the flicker of movement and decided whether it's worth chasing." The humans who survived the night weren't those who feared predators most. They were the ones who respected them. and respect begins with understanding. Many of the defensive behaviors we've seen, the ring-shaped camps, the multiple fires, the scent masking with ash and dung, the ritual noise at night, all of these arise from a single source: the ability to predict, to know what a lion might do before it does it, to anticipate where a cave bear might wander in spring, to sense when a hyena is testing and when it's committing. This predictive skill wasn't just practical, it became generational, passed from elder to child, not in words, but in repeated decisions. Where to camp, how to lie, when to stay silent. A child growing up in this world absorbed it long before they could explain it. The body learned what safety felt like, what tension felt like, what the dogs sensed when they rose in the dark. And by the time that child grew into a hunter, the model of the predator was already etched into their thoughts. They had rehearsed it thousands of times in sleep. The territory of dreams, too, became part of this training. Even unconscious, the mind remained sensitive to patterns of threat, a misplaced breath, a footfall that didn't match. Some researchers believe the reason humans developed such a capacity for vivid, even stressful dreams was to simulate danger before it arrived, to test possibilities in a place where death could not yet reach. And if that is true, then sleep itself became a forge, a place where humans practiced becoming something more than prey, not by conquering the wild, but by letting the wild reshape the way they imagined, by taking the predator into their mind and making space for it there. This internal shift, the ability to model another's intent, is what made humans different. It is the root of language, of planning, of ritual, and long before it was used to build societies or paint myths, it was used to survive the night, not by killing the lion, but by knowing the lion so well that it chose to walk away. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of survival, a form of power that leaves no wound, no boast. The fire still burns, the children still sleep, the snow still falls, and somewhere beyond the curve of the light, a shadow turns back into darkness. For our ancestors, that was victory, not a hunt won, not a beast slain, but another night endured, another dawn opening like a soft breath over the horizon, made possible not by strength alone, but by awareness, a kind of mental fire that burned long after the logs had gone to ash. We often ask, when did humans become human? Some say it was language, others, tools, art, burials, but perhaps it began even earlier. In the moment we stepped outside our own skin and entered the mind of something that wanted to end us. In the moment we asked, not how to run, but how it thinks. That is where strategy begins. That is where memory takes shape, and that is where sleep, even in the raw cold of the Mammoth Steppe, became possible. Because sleep in such a world was not just a pause in vigilance, it was the full expression of it. You could only sleep if you had prepared the circle well, if you had watched the wind, read the signs, understood what else might be awake when you closed your eyes. It wasn't trust, it was design, and it wasn't done alone. As the human mind evolved to carry these mental maps of predator behavior, those maps became shared. Gestures carried meaning. A glance, a hand raised at the camp's edge, a word murmured in a specific tone. You didn't have to say, "I heard something move like a stalking cat." You could say less and still be understood. That shared understanding was a kind of invisible architecture. It made the group stronger. Not just because more eyes could watch the dark, but because more minds could hold the pattern. One person remembering where the tracks were fresh, another feeling how the dogs had stiffened at moonrise, another recalling that last winter, the lions had come after the reindeer passed through. No one held the full picture alone, but together, they almost did. This was the beginning of collective defense, not through walls, but through minds aligned by memory, motion, and rhythm. They did not conquer their predators. They studied them, modeled them, became something new by imagining what hunted them, and still sleeping anyway. And it worked. For a time. But winter changes everything. When the snow deepened and the herds thinned, the rules bent. The lions came closer. The bears no longer slept. The hyenas grew fearless, hungrier, louder. It was no longer enough to understand. In the season of hunger, even wisdom could be tested, and sometimes survival meant breaking the patterns you trusted most, because the world itself could shift beneath your feet, not in a sudden cataclysmic moment, but slowly, inevitably, as the seasons turned, and when the snow deepened, the rules changed. The predators grew bold. The tracks in the snow told the truth before the wind could speak it. Circles where wolves had lingered near the edge of a camp. Heavy paw prints pressed deeper than they should have been. A sign of hunger, of weight lost, of distance traveled in search of something warm and alive. The silence of the woods became too clean. No birds. No deer. No small rustles from the ground. It was the stillness of scarcity. And that was the real danger, because Ice Age predators were not always hunting. Not every night brought risk. Most nights, even in the open, passed in relative peace, with the fire smoldering and the dogs calm. But in winter, or during long droughts, or when the herds changed course too early, hunger arrived. Not just for humans, but for every sharp-toothed thing with breath in its chest. So what is the quiet but persistent question that remains? How did our ancestors learn to survive not just predators, but desperation? Because when the wolves came in winter, they were not the same wolves who watched from the shadows in autumn. And when the cave bears rose early from hibernation, starving and blind, they were not the same slow-moving shapes seen in warmer months. Even the lions changed leaner, faster, no longer content to hunt only gazelle and horse. They came for the edges of the human camp. And sometimes they came for the center. Our ancestors knew this rhythm. Not in words, perhaps, but in instinct sharpened by generations. They understood that danger had a pulse, that the land itself breathed in cycles of hunger and ease. And so their survival depended not on constant vigilance, but on the ability to anticipate when vigilance mattered most. That meant watching not just the animals, but the plants, the rivers, the birds, the smell of the wind. It meant reading the entire biome like a living clock. When certain grasses vanished, the herds would not linger. When the snow fell too early, the predators would descend. When the scent of rot drifted from far-off valleys, it could mean a carcass had drawn scavengers, or it could mean something worse. In these moments, the question was not how to defend. It was whether to stay. Because sometimes, the smartest act was not to resist the storm, but to move with it, to take the fire, wake the children, and walk. Not in panic, not in retreat, but as part of a larger rhythm, a migration within a migration, a way of moving that mirrored the land itself, because the humans of the Mammoth Steppe were not only tracking herds, they were tracking hunger, and hunger had a season. Each winter, the predators became less predictable. But not because they were irrational. On the contrary, they were painfully logical. When food was scarce, the calculus of risk changed. Wolves that once avoided fire came closer. Hyenas that skulked at the edge now tested the circle. Lions that once passed in the distance slowed their pace and looked inward. Not every group survived these shifts, but those who did learned to move before hunger moved them. Their intelligence was not reactive. It was anticipatory. They noticed the early signs, the sudden stillness of grazing grounds, the emptiness of berry thickets, the fading calls of migrating birds. They noticed how fresh scat near a trail could mean that wolves were tracking them now, not merely passing through, but shadowing their journey, waiting for the group to split or rest too long. So they adapted. They shifted camp locations with the precision of ecological memory. High ridgelines offered visibility, but too much wind. Low valleys held warmth, but also funnels where predators could approach unseen. River bends were good in summer, but dangerous in frost. The ice-muffled footsteps made ambush easier. Camps were placed not just for comfort, but for calculation. What animal would move through here? When? From which direction? Had it denned yet? Had it bred? Was it desperate? The answers didn't come from maps. They came from the earth, from watching where the snow melted first, from noting how the soil darkened beneath trees that had dropped their fruit too early, from remembering, year after year, that the cave in the South Hill always stirred in the third moon, and that no one should sleep within shouting distance once the snow had cracked at its mouth. The people didn't speak of these things like rules. They carried them like weather, and weather, they knew, could turn. So when the cold grew sharp, and the dogs restless, they didn't wait. They dismantled their shelters, packed the skins, cleaned the firestones, and followed the curve of the herds. Not to hunt, not yet, but to survive alongside. To place their camps where bison still grazed, where muskox had not yet moved on, because where there were prey animals, the predators stayed cautious. But when the prey vanished, the rules collapsed, and in the season of hunger, even the fire could seem small. Its glow no longer guaranteed safety. Its warmth no longer guaranteed sleep. There were nights when it hissed alone under the snow-heavy sky, its smoke rising into a silence too thick to trust. The predators, too, watched the fire, but not with fear, with calculation. So the humans adapted again. They began to do something dangerous, something clever. They learned how to appear larger than they were. Sometimes this meant leaving decoy fires, small hearths kept alive at the edge of a camp, far from where anyone slept. These gave the illusion of presence, tricking the eye of anything circling in the dark. Sometimes they left the bones of large kills in open view, signs that the group had brought down something powerful, even if the meat had long been gone. But more often, it meant choosing risk with precision. When hunger pressed close, they moved their camps into unfamiliar places, taking advantage of the fact that animals, too, avoided what they didn't know. The burned grove, the open stone shelf, the edge of a frozen bog where scent trails vanished. In these places, there were no guarantees, but sometimes there was time. Time to sleep, time to warm the children, time to wait out the season. This wasn't guesswork. It was strategy built on memory. Somewhere, generations before, someone had made a mistake, had camped too close to a den, too late in the frost, too long without moving. That memory lingered. Not in stories always, but in patterns, in the way shelters were placed with care, in how elders walked the perimeter twice before settling, in the quiet look passed between companions when the wind changed direction. Planning meant remembering, and remembering meant living not only in the present moment, but in the accumulated layers of a landscape shaped by fire, ice, fur, and hunger. People remembered where they had last seen the herds, where the wolves had crossed, where someone had once disappeared. Even footprints in frozen mud could become messages left on purpose to say, "We passed here, but we're not here now." Because to survive the season of hunger wasn't only about enduring it, it was about outlasting it. And that meant more than fire, more than vigilance. It meant knowing how to be unseen, how to move when others stayed, how to follow the edge of risk without stepping fully inside it, because even the predators were watching each other, and in this cold chessboard of meat and mind, the ones who could think the furthest ahead were the ones who woke to see spring. The ones who woke to see spring had thought further than the lion, because by the depths of winter, the animals no longer behaved like themselves. Hunger rearranged their logic. It made bold what was once cautious, made silent what was once noisy. The wolf no longer waited for stragglers. The hyena no longer traveled in tight groups. The bear usually still came early, thin, and half mad with need. And the lion began to test fire, not all at once, not with a roar or a charge, but with silence, the kind that walked the perimeter just once and vanished, the kind that left no tracks, only a shift in the air, a sound just soft enough to stir a dog from sleep. In these moments, sleep itself became fragile. So humans became creative. They stopped thinking in terms of defense alone. They began to engineer the idea of delay, a strategy not meant to stop a predator, but to slow it, confuse it, make it hesitate. Food scraps were placed in shallow pits at the edge of scent range. These were not meals, they were decoys, an offering perhaps, a message. There is something here, but not enough. Move on. Elsewhere. It didn't always work, but often it was enough. Enough to shift the attention, enough to buy a night, enough to let the children sleep. Sometimes they hung entrails from branches, not to feed, but to alter scent trails. Sometimes they created false trails entirely dragging skins or ash in wide arcs around a camp to break the line of movement. Even human waste was sometimes relocated far from camp, not for hygiene alone, but because it could become a beacon to the hungry. The edge of survival was no longer the spear, it was the choice of where to step, where to squat, where to bury bones. These were not accidents, these were calculations, and in the middle of that invisible network of scent and silence was the fire, still burning, still watched. But now the circle around it had tightened. People slept closer together, not only for warmth, but for reaction time. One body twitching in sleep could wake the rest. One cough, one intake of breath, all meant something. No one slept deeply, but all slept in turns. That too was a design, because in the worst of the lean season, no single person could watch the night alone, and no single person could remember all the rules. It was in these months that memory became shared, distributed across the minds of the group. One person recalling the old migration routes, another watching the sky, another listening for patterns in the dog's breathing, another simply sitting near the fire and waiting, not for the danger to pass, but for the season itself to shift, because that was the true intelligence of the Mammoth Steppe. It was not in holding ground, it was in letting go of it, knowing when to move, when to stay, and when to simply endure not by force, but by rhythm, the rhythm of hunger and return, of cold and thaw, of the invisible line that separated a safe camp from a final one. And when the thaw came, when the air softened, when the birds returned, when the first herds were spotted on the horizon, the shift in the camp was almost imperceptible. A longer sleep, a deeper breath. The silence broke, not with words, but with motion. The skins unrolled, the flint was checked, the caches uncovered, and slowly they walked again. But even in the ease of spring, the memory lingered. Hunger taught things that meat could not erase. It carved ideas into the group's bones. It shaped belief. Over generations, those moments of near loss became something larger. Not just memory, but story. Not just caution, but ritual. Don't camp near the Black Hill. Always move before the third frost. Leave food for the lion who watches. Never point at the bear's den. These were not just habits. They were threads in a tapestry of knowledge far older than any single life. They helped encode what the body already knew, that survival required long vision, that the land gave and the land took, and that those who lasted were not always the strongest, or the loudest, or the bravest, but the most attuned. The people of the Ice Age had no calendars, but they knew time, not by numbers but by signals. The lean season was a teacher, and it did not forget. It showed them what the world could become when balance slipped, when hunger ruled every choice, every sound, every step. And so they listened, not just to each other, but to everything. The earth, the wind, the patterns of birds, the silence of prey, the restlessness of dogs, the weight of snow. They carried this sensitivity forward, across rivers, through tundra, into forests yet to form. It became part of their blood, part of us, because we too come from people who slept while watched, who learned not to fight the dark, but to move within it, and who made it not by conquering scarcity, but by preparing for its return. Yet even the best preparation could falter. Sometimes the fire died, not because of fear, but because of wind, or rain, or sheer exhaustion. Sometimes the wood was too wet, the embers drowned, and in those moments, those quiet, awful moments, everything else had to take over. Memory, movement, instinct, because when the fire failed, so did the barrier, and sleep became a question, with no promise of answer. Soon, we will descend into those rare but deadly hours, the ones when the light vanished, and all that stood between life and the dark was silence, shadow, and the will to survive. The ones who woke to see spring had prepared for many things, but not everything, because even fire, for all its brilliance, could falter. And when it did, the line between safety and sleep was the first to vanish. Sometimes the wood was wet. Sometimes the wind shifted too fast. Sometimes a single ember, carried on the wrong breath of air, failed to catch. And sometimes the people simply couldn't keep watch. The body, after days of walking or weeks of hunger, surrendered. Eyes closed. The rhythm broke, and the fire went dark. That was the edge. Without firelight, the camp lost its perimeter. The scent of smoke no longer held back the lions. The dogs no longer had a fixed center to circle. The silence grew longer than intended. And in that silence, sleep, that fragile pause, became dangerous. The land remembers. In scattered sites across the steppe, archaeologists have found camps where sleep was not protected. A butchered carcass left unfinished, tools still lying beside a stone where hands once worked. Footprints that begin near a hearth and scatter in every direction. Burned layers above broken bones. Charred wood piled hastily, then abandoned. The stories aren't written, but they are carved into ash and soil and crushed ivory. They speak of nights when sleep was broken, or never came. Still, the people endured. Not because they could stop every danger, but because they expected failure. They trained for it. Not in words, but in the structure of the camp. Fire was central, yes. But so was the backup plan. Some groups placed decoy fires away from where they actually slept. Others organized the sleeping circle around children or elders, placing the strongest at the edges with their backs to the dark. Spears were placed just so, not for display, but so a hand could find one even in panic. Escape paths were known by feel: the slope behind the sleeping ground, the notch in the ridge, the smooth stone by the creek, where you turned left. They didn't wait for disaster to ask, "How do we sleep without fire?" They asked it first, because they had seen what happened when others didn't. And those memories became part of their survival, silent, embedded in the shapes of their shelters, in the way a guard was woken before their shift, in how a torch was always kept smoldering just beyond the ring of light. It wasn't paranoia. It was love and memory, and the hard knowledge that sleep was never guaranteed. It had to be earned, again and again. Even now, in the quiet of the dark, we carry this wisdom. We check the locks. We leave the hallway light on. We wake at sounds we don't remember hearing, because somewhere far behind us, someone once woke too late, and the fire had already failed. And in that moment, the night returned to its full weight. No flickering shadows, no scent of ash, no sounds but breath and wind, and the crack of frost shifting under furred paws. The world outside the circle was no longer pushed back, it was here. Inside. In reach. This is not imagination. The earth records these events. There are campsites where meals were prepared, but not eaten. Where hearths were blackened, but the sleeping rings around them are missing. Flint tools lie half-shaped beside broken branches. Scattered bones mark the sudden rush of flight. In some rare sites, two fires sit close together, one still intact, one stamped out mid-burn. Something had gone wrong. The rhythm of the night had been shattered, and in that shattering, sleep was the first to flee. But not all camps ended in silence. Some groups survived those nights, not because they were lucky, but because they had planned for when fire would fail. Their safety net was not flame, it was choreography. Their answers weren't written. They were shaped into the land. One trail pressed slightly deeper than the rest, always leading away from camp. A pile of stones aligned with the silent, practiced map that everybody knew how to follow in the dark. These were people who had asked the question before it mattered: what do we do when there is no light? Where do the children go? Who does not sleep? Slope of escape. Dog paths worn into the edges of thorn breaks. A spear left pointing toward the nearest hollow log, not as a weapon, but as a compass. Even sleep itself was arranged around the worst. Bodies curled inward, shoulder to shoulder, forming rings within rings. Those on the outside did not rest deeply. Their role was different. One eye open, one ear toward the wind, hands near the tools. When the fire failed, they moved first not to fight, but to signal. A single breath held too long. A slow exhale. A hand pressed to the back of the sleeper beside them, and then the motion began. There are signs that some groups use decoys, smoldering bundles of skin or dung thrown beyond the sleeping circle, meant to create a false center. In others, the group split, sending a small party away with the children, while the rest made noise or cast burning branches in every direction, hoping to distract or confuse. It was chaos, but not without order. The choreography was not about defeating the threat. It was about buying enough time to sleep again, because that was always the goal, to find, once more, a place quiet enough, still enough, safe enough to close your eyes, even if only for an hour, even if only in shifts, because even 1 hour of sleep, stolen back from chaos, could decide everything that followed. The human body cannot outrun exhaustion forever, especially not in the cold, especially not when you must remain alert. When fire fails, it is not only predators that press in, it is collapse from within. The eyes blur, the hands grow clumsy, the voice forgets how to whisper, and still, they had to move, find cover, regroup, warm what little they carried, and somehow sleep again. Somewhere in the darkness, a second fire would be lit. This was not just a technical act. It was psychological repair, a re-establishment of the center, of pattern, of rhythm. Because when the fire dies, the pattern dies with it, and with it the possibility of sleep. Rekindling was not just about flame, it was about memory. The new fire would often be smaller, less visible, shielded, but it had meaning. And where there was fire again, the eyes began to close. Children were the first to drift off. Dogs followed. Then the older ones, wrapped in skins and pressed close. The strongest stayed up, scanning, turning, breathing evenly, listening to the night for changes in rhythm, waiting for the stillness to return. But even then, the trust was bruised, and this is something rarely spoken of in reconstructions, the emotional aftermath of a failed night. We can see the new fire pits. We can estimate the sudden move, but we cannot see the caution that settled into the bones, the deeper alertness, the harder grip on the spear when dreams returned. Sleep did not come freely after such a night. It had to be coaxed back, and often it came haunted. Yet humans, in their quiet brilliance, turned even these failures into instruction. The young ones who lived through such nights were told the story again and again, not to scare them, but to prepare them. The names of the trees they should run toward, the direction of the wind, the shape of the cloud that came before danger. These weren't fairy tales. They were blueprints of what to do when the fire goes out. And when those children grew older, they slept closer to the edge, not because they were reckless, but because they remembered. In this way, every broken night gave rise to a new generation of watchers, not warriors but sleep keepers, those who carried the burden of staying awake, just long enough for others to rest. Even now, something of them lives on, the way we stir at unfamiliar sounds, the way we check the door twice, the way we pause, without knowing why, just before sleep pulls us under. It is not fear, it is memory, carried forward like a smoldering coal, because survival was never just about escaping death. It was about restoring the conditions for sleep. That was always the quiet goal. Not victory, not conquest, not even safety in the strongest sense, but the restoration of enough calm, enough rhythm, for sleep to return. And to do that, sometimes the most important defenses weren't spears or fire, but misdirection. Some Ice Age groups, it seems, became masters of confusion. Fossil sites in open plains show unusual burn marks in crescent patterns, not around camps, but off to the side, as if fires had been deliberately lit away from where people actually slept. These could have been decoys, set to lure predators toward warmth, away from the sleeping ring. A gamble, yes, but one with purpose. Because if it worked, sleep returned to the real camp. In other areas, rock alignments suggest false walls, thickets of bones, woven bramble, or stacked branches arranged to look like barriers, but with subtle openings behind them. Not to stop a predator, but to guide it, to turn it just enough, to buy the group 5 more seconds, 10 more breaths, long enough to vanish down the retreat slope. Some groups even used scent as a tool of misdirection. Ash trails, scattered urine-soaked hides, rotting meat tied high in trees. Anything to make the air confusing, to muddle the path between predator and prey. It didn't have to work forever. Only long enough for someone to rest, because that was the real measure of whether a tactic had worked. Not if the animal died, not if the camp held, but if, by the next night, the people slept again. Even in the aftermath of terror, they measured their recovery by sleep. Did the children stop crying? Did the dogs curl beside the fire? Did the old woman fall asleep without rocking? Did someone dream? These were the signs, and they mattered, because in a world where no walls existed, where every night was claimed, not granted the ability to sleep was the clearest signal of success. If they could sleep, they would live. The cost of failure was not just death. It was the inability to rest. And in that, the people of the Mammoth Steppe became architects of invisible defenses, not just in how they fought, but in how they learned to recover the night. Every fire rekindled was an act of resistance. Every curled body, every exhale beneath a fur cloak, was a sign that balance had been restored, even if only for a while, even if only until morning, because the promise of morning was never certain. Not here. Not on this wind-carved plain, where lion eyes shone like low stars and silence could turn into death without a sound. But they made it through, and when they did, they remembered, not through writing, not through monuments, but through shapes in the land, and stories told in the hush of firelight. In some camps, archaeologists find patterns of stones placed just beyond the hearth, not functional, not architectural, but repeating. The same crescent, the same curve, the same small, deliberate marks. These were not walls, they were reminders. The map of the night, the fire failed, redrawn, so it would not be forgotten. In other places, we find reburied bones, not of prey, but of kin, buried shallow, disturbed, then placed again with care. It suggests return. Not immediate, maybe not even within one generation, but return nonetheless. Someone came back, perhaps to honor, perhaps to warn, perhaps to sleep once more in the same circle. This is how memory moved across the steppe, through the lines of a song, through the way a child was taught to hold a torch, through a story whispered before sleep, a story not meant to frighten, but to prepare. And that is how they passed down protocols without speaking of fear. They didn't say, "One night the fire died." They said, "Here's where you put the ash." They didn't say, "We barely escaped." They said, "If the dogs are quiet too long, follow the ridge." They didn't say, "Don't sleep." They said, "Sleep with your back to the wind, and let the strongest watch the east." The knowledge was lived, not taught, passed on in footsteps, in gestures, in the arrangement of stones and bodies, and each group carried these stories in their own way. Some through song, some through silence, some through ritual that seems opaque to us now, lines of ochre, deer bones threaded with fiber, ash mounds never disturbed, but always, behind it all, the question, can we sleep here? That was the final measure, the test of whether the plan had held. The fire had failed, yes, but if they could sleep again, the camp was whole. And so they did. Not deeply, not for long, but enough. And somewhere in the dark, a child's breath slowed. A dog turned once in the dust. A fire whispered back to life. And a night that began in fear ended in rest. But not all danger came from teeth and claws. Some came from time itself, from the long hunger, the fading herds, the changing sky, and when the season turned against them, fire alone was not enough. What came next required something more. Because hunger might pass, claws might be outrun, But forgetfulness, that was fatal in slower ways. It wasn't enough to build the perfect camp or survive the terrible night. What mattered was remembering why it had worked, and teaching that memory to the next ones, and the ones after them, until it lived not only in fire circles and escape routes, but in the body, in the voice, in the mind. This was the true miracle of our ancestors. They carried the camp inside them. Long after a site was abandoned, after the ash had scattered and the bones had turned pale under wind, the shape of that camp survived in memory, in song, in ritual, in things whispered just before sleep. You don't build a perfect fire every night by accident. You don't place your back to the wind every night because of luck. You do it because it's been done before, because someone told you, because someone sang it into your bones. This is where survival became culture. The voice, that same voice once used to sing to the night, to ward off lions and lull the children, became a vessel of inheritance. A vessel for how to sleep without being eaten, for where to place your feet in the dark, for what kind of silence meant safety and what kind did not. The human mind, by 30,000 years ago, was not just remembering what happened, it was rehearsing what might happen. What begins as knowledge soon becomes myth, not as fantasy, but as structure. Story becomes storage. The tale of the boy who slept too close to the edge, the mother who kept fire even in rain, the dogs who saw what humans missed. These are not entertainment. These are architecture walls made of narrative, fences shaped from memory. And if they worked, people slept. That was the test. That was the proof. If the stories were strong enough, if the ritual was performed right, if the taboo was remembered and passed on and felt even when forgotten, then the children would wake up in the morning. The camp was no longer just outside, in the dust and thorn. It was in the mind. Each person carried it, a map of safety, a compass of signs. This tree means wind shelter. This bird calls too late at night. This scent means a lion passed 5 breaths ago. This silence is wrong, and perhaps most importantly, this place is not for sleeping. Move, and remember why. Because not every danger was visible. Not every predator had teeth. Some lived in patterns, in the way someone forgot to stir the fire, or left food too close to the sleeping ring, or chose the wrong slope on a windy night. So, the people built rules, not written, not explained, but felt, shared, reinforced over time until they became reflex culture as a survival reflex. We see the shadows of these rules in symbolic behavior. In one cave, ochre was smeared only on the southern walls, never the north. Why? We don't know. But perhaps the north was linked with wind, or darkness, or an old attack passed down in memory. Perhaps the taboo was never spoken aloud, only taught through quiet refusal. Not here, not that wall. And in another site, high in what is now Spain, we find repeated patterns of stones arranged in arcs, sometimes framing a hearth, other times simply ringing the open ground. These weren't for warmth or cooking. The stones are too small, too soft, but maybe, just maybe, they marked the sleep boundary, the threshold between dream and danger, a soft signal. You do not lie beyond this line, and even in the body itself, the knowledge was stored. Certain sleep postures are found again and again in burial sites. Fetal position, hands drawn inward, back to the earth, always curled, always facing inward. And while these positions are most often interpreted as symbols of rebirth or rest, could they also be echoes of a deeper habit, the safe way to sleep, learned in life and carried into death? We cannot say for sure. But the repetition speaks, and the pattern suggests something more than chance. So how do we classify this? It isn't architecture, it isn't technology, it isn't language, not in the way we usually define it. But it is something, a code, a system, a way of embedding memory into place, into motion, into silence. And if it worked, then someone would sleep again. The genius of these internal structures is that they didn't need to be explained. They worked without thought, like a muscle trained by repetition, like breath adjusting in cold air. And this is what made them powerful. When the fire was low, when the stars turned, when the lions stopped calling, and the silence began, the people knew. Without speaking, without turning, they knew where not to step, where not to sleep, and in that way the danger passed them by, not because they were stronger, but because they had remembered. When memory became routine, and routine became ritual, the act of sleeping outside among predators no longer relied only on luck or vigilance. It was structured into the culture itself. Oral knowledge carried this structure. Each story, chant, or nightly instruction was not decoration, it was insulation, a layer between the sleeper and the dark. Long before writing, people used voice as a tool for continuity, not just to share events, but to encode decision-making. The tale of the grandmother who moved the camp before the snows, or the uncle who ignored the wind and lost 3 goats, were not simply moral lessons. They were compressed intelligence, caution distilled. Each retelling was not merely memory, but prevention, survival, passed down through tone and rhythm. Some of these stories were performed before sleep, not for entertainment, but as alignment, a kind of evening calibration. The same words repeated, not because they were beautiful, but because they helped the group remember which sounds to ignore, which silences to notice, which behaviors to avoid. We see echoes of this in modern oral societies, where certain tales are only told at night, or only in the presence of children. These aren't accidents, they are design. There may have been songs that were never sung during daylight, chants that were only whispered beside embers, verses that taught the right distance to sleep from the fire. No single story survives from that time, but the patterns do. The length of pauses, the use of repetition, the assigning of animal voices to unseen events in the dark. It was not only a way to soothe the group, but to hard-code the memory of what to do when the pattern breaks. This is where the camp truly entered the mind, because when you no longer need to see the fire ring to remember how it was built, when the smell of ash is enough to recall the danger of sleeping too close to waste, you have internalized the architecture. You become, in a sense, a carrier of the camp itself. And when that person walks on, to new terrain, under different stars, they do not need to relearn everything. They already know how to survive the night. Even in unknown places, the old map remains. Which way to lie if the wind is coming from the east? Where to place the guard if the ground is soft? How to move if the barking stops suddenly? This is the role of oral tradition at its highest form, not just to retell what happened, but to simulate what might happen again. And because of that, people kept sleeping. Not always well, not always fully, but enough. And that, too, was passed down, the expectation that sleep was not perfect, but it could be protected. Through fire, through scent, through voice, and through memory shaped into sound, culture became a container for what could not be carried in the hands. You could not take the fire with you. You could not always bring the thorns, or the ring of bones, or the perfect slope with clear sightlines. But you could bring the rule that no one sleeps near the water's edge. You could bring the habit of circling twice before lying down. You could bring the soft throat sounds mimicking a feeding hyena, meant to trick other predators into thinking the territory was already taken. None of this was random. Each gesture, habit, or rule was selected over generations, kept because it worked. And slowly, these unspoken strategies fused with identity. It became not just what we do to stay alive, but who we are when we sleep in wild places. Some groups likely had entire layers of behavior that only made sense through shared memory. A hand raised at twilight could mean something more than farewell. A pile of leaves overturned before resting might signal the direction of wind. A scratch on a barkless trunk might mark the route to safety. Even laughter, quiet, strange, and sudden, could have been a deliberate sound, meant to unsettle listeners beyond the campfire, hinting that humans were not afraid, because the goal was not just to survive predators, but to let the youngest sleep through their approach. This is where the strength of symbolic behavior becomes clear. Not in its mystery, but in its precision. Taboos were not irrational superstitions. They were boundaries built from hard experience. A certain tree never cut, a direction never slept in, a combination of sounds never spoken near fire. If they were followed, people slept. If they were broken, someone woke up to growling. Or didn't wake up at all. We may never know the exact rules. We don't have their voices, only the objects they left behind. But we see repetition. We see circles within circles, red ochre near fire rings, repeated shapes in discarded bones. These are not random signs. They are echoes of systems meant to protect something fragile, not just life, but the pattern of life that allowed for rest. And in every system, the first test was whether a child could close their eyes. This tells us something about what mattered. The camp was always a negotiation. Between noise and silence, between warmth and visibility, between vigilance and sleep. And to keep it balanced, every member of the group, from the oldest to the youngest, had to remember their part, not through constant explanation, but through culture, and culture held the camp long after the fire was gone. And that is what made human sleep possible, even in lion country. It wasn't fire alone. It wasn't strength or speed or numbers. It was the quiet choreography of memory, the way knowledge slipped from one generation to the next, not through instruction manuals, but through presence, through gesture, through the way someone set down a stone without needing to say why. The mind became a camp of its own, a layered shelter of impressions and rules, of half-remembered warnings and deeply embedded rhythms. Over time, it became so natural, so seamless, that no one needed to ask where the guard should sit or which side of the fire to place the babies. They knew, just as those before them had known, just as those who followed would feel, without knowing where the knowledge came from. And it worked. For tens of thousands of years, it worked. In a world without fences, without permanent homes, without certainty, people slept. They slept beneath stars that held no promises. They slept knowing there were eyes in the dark. They slept knowing that if they forgot even one rule, even once, they might not wake. But they still slept, and they dreamed. Dreams may have been the final layer, the place where everything came together. The fire, the scent, the voice, the stories, the silences. In dreams, the old dangers returned, but so did the ancestors. So did the instructions. So did the shape of the camp, even if it had changed in the waking world. The camp inside the mind did not require geography. It did not need wood or stone. It only needed to be remembered, and in remembering, it protected. Some stories may never be reconstructed. Some warnings may have faded as the world changed, but the human mind still bears their imprint. In the way we double-check locks, in the way we teach lullabies that carry old, invisible rules, in the way we instinctively seek enclosed spaces for rest, even in places we know to be safe. The instincts were never erased. They were absorbed, and so the line continues not as a myth, but as a quiet architecture that still lives in our routines, our senses, our evening rituals. The simple act of sleep, carried forward by those who learned how to shape the dark into safety. Their fire still burns, though we no longer see the smoke. Their stories still echo, though we no longer remember the words. And the camp remains, if not in soil, then in mind. But the world was still changing, and the night still had more to teach. There was one chapter left, not about what they built, but what they became. But the world was still changing, and the night still had more to teach. All that remains now are fragments, slivers of bone, blackened soil, the ghost of a hearth that once flickered against the frost. The people who lived here are gone, but what they built has not vanished entirely. It waits beneath the earth, patient and partial, a curved tibia bearing marks of healed wounds, a fire ring layered with charcoal from dozens of burns, a tooth polished from years of gnawing left beside a child sleeping hollow. These are not ruins in the classical sense. They are quieter than that. But they speak, and what they tell us is this: they survived, not through domination, not through heroic conquest, but through a million careful choices made under starlight, through sleep, somehow achieved in a world of claws and ice. The first question we can ask of these remains is the simplest: why are they here at all? Why do we find so many traces of human presence in the open, far from caves, in exposed river bends, or on high plateaus where wind and predator paths crossed? The answer, though incomplete, appears to echo everything we've followed so far, because these locations were chosen, repeatedly, with intent, not always for comfort, but for strategy. What the bones suggest is that humans were not scattered randomly across the Mammoth Steppe. The evidence from sites like Dolny Vjestanice, Mezerich, and Kostenki shows settlement patterns that are spatially organized. Hearths are not thrown together. Waste is pushed downwind. Sleeping hollows are grouped tightly, protected by rings of debris. And sometimes, those patterns are layered. Not once, but again and again, for generations. As if the memory of safety was carried forward not through walls, but through rhythm. Here, the scientific evidence becomes a kind of forensic map, a line of red ochre outlining where feet once padded, a patch of calcined bone marking where fires burned hotter than usual, a pile of fractured mammoth ribs arranged into what may have been a windbreak or a signal. Each clue on its own is quiet, but together they form a picture, a logic of survival that was not improvised, it was engineered, not with blueprints, but with memory. Not with rulers, but with ritual, and always with the intention to sleep, to rest, even briefly, in a space that felt earned, not because the world was safe, but because they had learned how to shape its danger, to listen, to anticipate, to remember what the last winter taught, and fold it into the next. This chapter begins in silence, the silence of bones, of ash, of ancient soil. But the silence is not empty. It is full of lives that found a way to lie down at night, close their eyes, and survive. When archaeologists brush dust from a fire pit or measure the arc of a mammoth bone wall, they are not simply cataloguing debris. They are decoding a kind of architecture, not the grand monuments of later civilizations, but a quieter form survival architecture. These spaces were engineered for breath, warmth, and silence. Not permanence, but presence. At first glance, a Paleolithic campsite appears simple. A hearth, some bones, flint tools, perhaps a pit lined with hide. But the arrangement tells another story. The hearth is rarely at the center. It sits slightly off, often aligned with prevailing wind. Behind it, curved bone walls form a partial shield. Sleeping hollows lie in its lee, forming a ring or crescent that keeps bodies close to warmth but out of smoke. Refuse piles are found at the perimeter, never beside the fire, never beside the place where heads would have rested. These aren't random patterns. They're composed perhaps unconsciously, but composed nonetheless. In Ukraine, the mammoth bone huts of Mezerich stand as frozen echoes of this logic. The bones are massive, scavenged from the dead, or taken from hunted animals, then carefully interlocked into ovals and circles. The huts were insulated with mud and hides, but more interesting than what they were made from is how they were placed. Always grouped, never isolated. Each structure opened toward a central space, a communal zone likely shared fires, meals, and night watches. Even in shelter, they leaned toward togetherness. And at Dolny Vjestanice, the hearths are spaced rhythmically, surrounded by semicircles of flint flakes and bone fragments. These aren't simply the leftovers of butchery, they form a barrier, a passive defense. Light enough for visibility, sharp enough for bare padded feet to avoid. Perhaps predators learned too that firelight and flint scatter meant the territory was claimed, and predators learn quickly. What emerges from these details is not an image of humans cowering in nature. It is one of active shaping. Ice Age people were not wandering through danger. They were building safety in the places where danger came closest, and that safety was measured in sleep, not in hours perhaps, not in comfort, but in continuity. The same fire kindled again, the same ring reinforced, the same spot chosen for its curve of slope, for its line of sight, for the way the wind passed cleanly across a bed of coals without smothering them. All of it was data not written, but remembered, tested each night, adjusted by the season. These were people who thought in circles, not just for warmth, but for rhythm, not just for proximity, but for trust, not just for living, but for lying down together and letting go. They did not wait for safety to come. They built it, piece by piece, into the places they would dare to sleep, to design a space where people could sleep, not just survive the night, but actually rest required more than physical tools. It required something older, deeper, and less visible. It required agreement. The Ice Age was not kind to disunity. A single misstep, a single forgotten task, could leave the group exposed. Leaving food uncovered, letting the fire dip too low, walking out of earshot without a signal. Each of these could mean someone wouldn't wake the next morning. So a kind of soft discipline emerged, not imposed from above, but built into the way people lived together. The camp was a diagram of trust. Where you slept and how close said something about your role. Where the dogs curled, where the infants were laid, where the sentinels sat with their backs to the wind. All of this was placement by memory, not by command. Patterns evolved, and those patterns became rituals. You didn't have to ask where to lie down. You just knew, and knowing was everything. We see it in the consistency of hearth clusters, in the way certain tools are always found near the fire and others always outside the ring. We see it in the paths worn between resting spots and waste zones, in the polish of bone used not for hunting, but for digging hollows or shaping embers. These people weren't improvising. They were remembering, and the thing they remembered was how to make space safe enough for everyone to sleep. This required not only engineering of terrain, but engineering of emotion. You cannot sleep near someone you don't trust. Not deeply. Not in that old world, where the dark could still kill you. So survival depended on more than strength. It depended on the kind of social glue that made coordination possible without explanation. Shared rhythms, shared expectations, shared watchfulness. Someone always tending the fire, someone always listening for sounds just outside the circle. And the success of that system wasn't measured in animals hunted, or tools made, or migrations achieved. It was measured in the quietness of the night, in the fact that, most nights, no one screamed, no one fled, no one died. Archaeology can't fully reconstruct the emotional temperature of a camp, but it can suggest it. The repeated use of certain spots, the return to the same layouts across centuries, the artifacts that show touch and care, carved figures, engraved bones, pigment applied to tools that never left the home. These all whisper that people were not simply enduring, they were shaping meaning, and meaning made the dark smaller. When the world is that raw, cooperation is not a virtue, it's the only tool that lets you sleep. And that tool, passed forward, became culture, became habit, became the geometry of survival, became, in time, the quiet in their bones. To look at a burned patch of earth and see a story requires imagination, but not fiction. The bones do not lie, and the charcoal does not exaggerate. What endures is not myth, it is the residue of decisions. And once you learn to read those decisions, the old world becomes less distant. A single charred mammoth scapula, propped upright, like a screen. Why? To reflect heat? To block wind? To mark a boundary between those who watched and those who slept? Its meaning may be lost, but its presence is deliberate. A soft curve, positioned with care. And when we find the same gesture, repeated across valleys and rivers, among peoples who never met, we begin to see something more than survival. We see convergence, intelligence that moves in patterns. Our ancestors were not at the mercy of the wild. They lived within it, yes, but they read it, shaped it, and in their own way, collaborated with it. The world they slept in was not tamed, but it was known, not controlled, but negotiated. A lion was still a lion. The cold was still the cold. But between those threats, they carved out little sanctuaries, not with walls, but with understanding. This is the great inversion. Prehistoric people are often imagined as brutes running, fighting, fleeing, but the bones tell another tale. They speak of planning, of sites used not once, but a dozen times, of spatial memory so refined that it echoes even now in the layout of their remains. These were not accidents of rest. They were experiments in shelter. Each camp was a hypothesis, each fire a theory tested, each ash ring a quiet conclusion drawn in flame. We begin to see these people not as primitives, but as designers of survival, as makers of meaning, as collaborators with time. They understood that to rest in the open, they had to think like everything around them, not just the predators, but the wind, the slope, the cycle of stars, the hunger of early spring. They didn't merely react to the world. They learned to anticipate it, to step just far enough ahead that they could still lie down and wake up in the same spot. And so the final transformation is not theirs alone. It is ours, because once you begin to see the logic in those remains, the invisible camp that still hovers in the air above the bones, you cannot go back. The old cliché of caveman fear dissolves. The image of brutish, helpless humans clinging to fire is replaced by a more powerful one. Humans who knew, who listened, who remembered, and who through that remembering made the wild world restable. And so we return to the beginning not of the world, but of a question. How did they sleep? How did families rest with wolves nearby? With lions pacing the edge of shadow? With wind dragging the scent of blood across open ground? The answer is not a single tool or a clever trick. It is not fire alone, or dogs alone, or circles of bone and ash. The answer is a tapestry of practice of presence, woven so tightly that no thread could be pulled without unraveling the whole. It was a choreography, learned over generations, refined not by comfort, but by necessity. 1,000 small decisions repeated in the dark, until they became something more than instinct. They became knowledge. And knowledge, carried long enough, becomes memory. Not just individual memory, but species memory. A memory that outlives its makers. A memory that hides in our stories, our reflexes, our habits before sleep. That is what the bones tell us. Not just that they survived, but how. They whisper of caution, yes, but also of grace, of people who laid themselves down not because they had defeated the night, but because they had come to understand it, to coexist with it, to navigate its moods and patterns like a second terrain, one mapped not with paths, but with breath, with warmth, with song, with silence. They did not banish fear, but they held it in their arms and made room for rest beside it. This is the inheritance we barely recognize. The camp inside the mind, the rule without language, the comfort in closeness, the sense, even now, that fire means safety, that circles mean trust, that certain nights still carry an echo of footsteps we never heard. You are not so far removed from them. If you have ever sat quietly in the dark and listened for something just beyond the range of hearing, you have followed their ritual. If you have ever lit a fire and felt your body soften, you have entered their perimeter. If you have ever curled towards someone as sleep overtook you, because it felt safer that way, you have remembered them. They are not gone. Their bones remain, their ash circles, faint but precise. Their tools, their spacing, their silence. But more than that, their choices remain, woven into the shape of the human day, into the way we organize our rooms, protect our young, and signal when it's safe to rest. This was never a story of domination. It was a story of relation, of pattern, of patience, and it ends, not with victory, but with sleep, earned, against all odds, carried forward in quiet, carried forward in you. Thank you for walking this long arc of memory and fire, fellow Sapien, for stepping across the wind-worn Mammoth plains, where each ash circle held the shape of a sleeping body. If this story helped you find a little warmth in the dark, a moment of quiet wonder, or a sense of how far back human care can reach, then thank you truly for being here. I wonder what part of this story will stay with you tonight. A sound, perhaps. A shape. The way a ring of bones might still feel like shelter, even now. Whether it was the silent curve of a mammoth bone shelter, the flickering perimeter of embers stretched around sleeping kin, or the thought of hands drawing memory into soil, these are the echoes that bridge your night with theirs. If something stirred in you, I'd love to hear it below. A word, a sentence, a feeling. Your comment becomes part of the firelight we share, and helps build the quiet community we're slowly shaping here. Feel free to like, share, or subscribe if you'd like to wander further with us. There are still so many sleeping circles to uncover, and stories that haven't yet been told. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful,